Welcome back, everybody. I just wanted to make sure that we were back on our audio. So to this, I think for the afternoon, and I wanted to toss this out to the table, see how you feel. We have a very big section. Point 43 is a big section, and I think realistically, it will take a lot of time, potentially. So was wondering if people wanted, once we were done with this section, whether that would be sufficient to conclude our meeting for this time, with the exception of next steps, obviously. And then we would reconvene again February 12th and 13th. Does that sound like a plan, or is that a counter proposal plan? What do you think?
Sounds good.
I see no dissent. Somehow I was just not really expecting it, but I think we have to.
And then the plan then for the next block, what do you all have in mind sort of for how those 2 days will go? Just revisit some of the things we've already discussed, some of the things that we've put aside as things we want to revisit. I know, like,
Right.
Valley Qualified was something.
Right. So we can talk about next steps after we do that. I think that'd be more, we might have some of the things that come out of this that may impact that. So I don't want to schedule us for something that we may or
Understood.
may not need. But I'm happy, that's part of the next steps conversation, how this will move forward for the next round. So that gives us 3.5 hours.
Before we jump into either where we left off or the next topic,
Yes.
I have some statistical information on topics we've already talked about.
Oh, okay. Great.
If we're ready.
Yeah.
So when we were talking about suspensions, the question came up, about how many are they receiving, or how common is this? So last year, FedLoan received approximately 600 suspension forms, and how that compares is annually they get approximately 52,000 certification forms. So that just kind of gives you an idea of the volume comparatively.
Where is that data? Where did you find that information?
They sent it to me.
The FedLoan people sent it to you?
Yes.
Oh, great. Could you circulate that email to the
Sure.
group? That'd be great.
I will. And also, they emailed one clarifying point, that they have been applying suspensions, administrative suspensions, as a result of disasters, without the recipient requesting the suspense. There's no regulatory authority, but there is an administrative authority to do so, and they've been monitoring FEMA updates to apply suspension benefits under the department's direction. So I just want to let everybody know. So that's kind of a good thing made me feel good to hear that, so I wanted to share that with everybody.
General disaster, dear colleague.
Yep.
Did it have in there how many of those are the suspension applications, right? The 600?
Correct.
Did they talk about how many of those were approved?
No, but I'll ask.
Because I believe that was your question, right? From our earlier conversation.
Since you're asking, maybe how long it took them, what's the average time for examining and sending out notification on the suspension? Thank you. Yeah, no harm in asking whether they answer or not. That's a whole other thing.
Oh, also, I just would like to strike the approved by the Office of Management and Budget under control number 1845-0083 for periods of suspension. Documenting this, I think it should, let's see. It may show up in documenting the service obligation, where it's showing up in these forms that haven't actually gone through the OMB process. I'm sure it will have a control number as it will go through now, but currently it has not been approved.
You're proposing to have me
Let's
delete it
see.
in both places, correct?
Yes, so it should be,
What is 1845-0083?
that's the ATS.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So
So I'm looking at page 23, where it says at the very bottom of 41, approved by the Office of Management and Budget under control number 1845-0083. 0083 is referring to the agreement to serve. It does not govern this process.
No, actually, I am not sure why in the regulations it says that, because the regulations also have to be cleared through OMB. And I frankly am not sure why that is showing the approval number for the agreement to serve. That seems odd, doesn't it?
Well, we wouldn't include it in a, we wouldn't include that information in proposed rules that go to a negotiating committee anyway. I mean, that's all
Yeah.
done after the fact, and it's a legal
Right.
requirement in certain instances. So it wouldn't, we wouldn't normally include that anyway and
Okay.
stuff, so.
I'm just wondering now if it's actually in the CFR.
Since, I mean, it's not so out of line that it would be there because these are suspensions of the, thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. It doesn't seem to be that odd to me because these are suspensions of the agreement to serve. So maybe that's why it's reflecting back on the agreement to serve.
My rationale was that it's not so weird.
Sorry, my rationale was that it's not so odd to have it there because these are suspensions of the agreement to serve. Now, necessarily in terms of the structure, since this all hasn't gone through OMB, it also is a question in the overall offering of regulatory language. But maybe that's, my thought is, why might it be there, is because we're talking about the agreement to serve. The suspension thereof.
Before we move on to the obligation to repay the grant, is there any other discussion on the previous issue? Just to close it out.
Going back, I think going back to the exception, I think we ended up agreeing that that was too broad. But we did want to tie it in with I think local not disasters, but local circumstances that may impede someone from fulfilling their employment obligations.
What page are you on?
Go back, go up just there where we have D, under exceptional circumstances. I think we agreed that that was too broad from DOE's perspective. But we were looking for language that dealt with the local impact that might occur that would impact someone's employment. And so we were looking at actually tying it, I guess, closer to, is it A or B?
Well, I think what we were doing was
4.
giving ourselves some time to think about it and maybe coming back to this later because we were talking about, do we need a list and what's in that list?
So maybe
and
we need
things
to highlight it, so
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
do something
you
to it
highlight
so
it
that we
so
can
that-
come back to
Yeah.
it.
Maybe change the comments to reflect the local.
To reflect that that's going to be revised in some way to reflect local concerns, rather than all the other stuff that's there, which,
Take everything out.
the comments.
Highlight it. Highlight the text, the comments.
Yeah, what I was saying is that the comments, in the comment bubbles, I should have maybe clarified, maybe make it clear that this is going to be reviewed in the context of local circumstances. Any other additions, comments?
And I'm not for sure it still would be included in the military spouses. I thought we had remedied that
I
early.
think the military spouses is going to be additional language because it's specific to that subset of people. But that we would draft for the next session and then bring it to the table.
Right, I was just saying it because it's, right now, it's in the comment section for there. Under that one, we just want to delete
Oh,
that
yeah.
from
That's
that.
what I was gonna say, you
that
need to
part
delete
of the
that,
comment
right, that
section.
makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And I think, David, correct me wrong if I'm wrong, but your your comment on that, I actually made some shorthand. It's not what you said, but it's what I interpreted. Incapacitating circumstances preventing service for a specific period of time, like not the 2 weeks strike. You may have had better words than that, but it's a little bit more than just incapacitating circumstances. Yeah, preventing service for a specific time.
Does that cover it? Okay. Return with fresh eyes. So our last and final section, which is point 43, obligation to repay the grant. So obviously, I'm just going to do the line by line. We have struck federal under A1. Then we move to the grant recipient, regardless of enrollment status, requests to teach grants be converted. Again, we've struck federal. Direct unsubsidized loan because he or she has decided not to teach in a qualified school or educational service agency or not to teach in a high-need field or for any other reason. And we have gone and struck a whole bunch of information there. We have struck within the 120 days of seeking enrollment. We have struck within 1 year. We have struck have been determined for a suspension for an 8-year period. We have struck be enrolled in Teach Grant eligible program, begun credible teaching. The only things we have left here, the grant recipient excuse me, does not begin or maintain qualified employment within the time frame that would allow an individual to complete the service obligation within the number of years required under 612.2. What we're trying to do here, the big picture is this. We're trying to simplify the conditions under which a student must repay the grant to two conditions only. First of all, that the student would request the grant be converted to a loan voluntarily, or the recipient does not begin or maintain a qualified employment within a time frame that would allow that recipient to actually complete the service obligation within the 8-year requirement. And that is it.
So the earliest that a grant would convert would be at the 4-year mark following ceasing enrollment at their institution, assuming they didn't re-enroll.
The earliest it would convert.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true? Would it be the earliest?
I mean, assuming, I think I understand what you're asking, assuming they didn't ask us to convert it.
Yeah,
if-
exactly. I'm talking about
if,
involuntary conversions.
You know, a little more than 4 years have passed and you haven't done any teaching at all and you haven't received a suspension, then you no longer have time to do your 4 years within the 8-year period. And remember, that is an existing trigger. We're not changing it. It's just, it's there now. And I don't know how many grants have been converted for that reason. We could find out. But yes, that's basically it.
If we could get that data, I am curious about how often that has happened. So that would be great, and I can submit that in writing later as well.
Okay.
Is that trigger at year 4 or year 5? I guess that's how you define
I-
the year,
yeah,
because,
I would
right,
have
if
to
you're
find
in
out
year
exactly how they've
4,
operationalized. I mean, obviously,
Right.
at precisely 4 years, you still,
You
if you
still-
started teaching, you could, but at some point after that,
Right.
then you've run out of time. Or if you
Correct.
had done 1 year and then you waited too many years before you did any more teaching, you could run out of time. It's going to vary from individual to individual.
Okay.
So.
I just wanted to make sure I was thinking correctly. Thank you.
And then I just wanted to confirm, just because I've heard from folks that a number of teachers who have had their grants convert when they have had a form for qualifying service rejected, that has triggered the conversion, that would no longer occur.
Well, I don't think people have had their grants converted simply because the form was missing some information. It would be because they didn't correct it and get it in by the deadline. That's the issue, is missing the deadlines, I
But
think.
under this, even if they miss the deadline for that year, as long as they're still able to fulfill their service requirements within the 8, even if they have a qualifying service year form that gets rejected,
Well-
that should not be a trigger for a
Well,
grant
with
conversion.
what we're proposing, there is no specific deadline for submit. You're still required after each year, this is statutory, after each year of teaching, you're required to send us something certifying your teaching, but there's no longer going to be a specific annual deadline for you to do that. You're going to be reminded regularly of this and expected to do it, but there's no longer going to be this annual deadline.
And that's why, way back when I said I think we are going to
Right.
come back and request just our recommendation be to strike this language, which I can't find now.
So, you know,
Yes.
because so many of these issues have involved missing this deadline, our thought is that these changes would really simplify the process by largely eliminating that issue.
So where,
It's at 686.12.
what page?
My page is not going to match.
I-
It's the agreement to serve, and it's under the contents, and we had indicated by the annual certification due date.
Oh, and now you do
Now,
that.
that's why, this is why we don't want that.
That's, okay.
Does that make sense?
It's page 11 of the original
Yeah.
red line.
Mine says 15, so you can see that.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that for the teachers that I have heard from who had their service year form rejected, you're saying that rejection should not have been the basis for their grant conversion. It should have been missing the annual intent to serve, right?
No, I'm saying that if they had it rejected because something was missing and they were told you need to resubmit it with the corrected information and you've got until this date to do it, the reason for the conversion should be because they missed that deadline, not simply because if they submitted it with something missing. Now, you could have a case, I suppose, where someone did not respond to the first 2 notices, because remember, people effectively get up to 90 days to do this. If you only responded to the 3rd and final notice, and then you didn't submit it until right towards the end of the deadline, and there was something wrong with it, then you can't do it because you're right up at the end. So, but you don't. My point was, you don't get converted simply because you sent something in a timely manner and it wasn't complete.
But what I hear you saying is that if you miss the deadline on qualifying your service year, even if you still could have fulfilled the service requirement, if you mess up on that timeline.
Well, that's the issue we're trying to address here and what we're doing with this reconsideration process, because we recognize that there were people who were fulfilling the service obligation but had their grants converted to loans simply because they missed this final deadline. That's what we're trying to address. But with the changes that we're proposing here, we're hoping to basically eliminate that issue.
However, what I'm saying is that regardless of whether or not a qualifying service year form is accepted or rejected, if they meet that timeline or not, that alone, if they can still fulfill the service requirement, should not have converted their loan at all,
You're saying
or their
in the
grant at
past.
all in the past. And I want to preserve that will not happen under the way that this is written, because it also wasn't written into the regulations before, but it sounds like that is the way it has been interpreted.
I'm not sure that I'm understanding what you're suggesting. Let's talk about going forward rather
Sure.
than, right. So are you suggesting, for example, that someone 6 years out who has not turned in anything at all could have their grants converted because more than 4 years have gone by, but then they turn in things saying, oh, wait, I taught for 4 years, I just never sent anything in, that will, are you,
No,
if
that
you
is
could
not
give
what
me
I'm
an
saying.
example of what you're
So,
talking about.
my example is a Teach grant recipient graduates from their program, they go into Teach, they get a qualifying service year, their first year teaching. The next year, they submit a form for a qualifying service year, and that form gets rejected for whatever reason. That second form has converted people's grants. And so I want to confirm that that would not happen under these regulations.
No, it would not. But again, if in the current scenario, if they submitted it and it was rejected because it was missing the signature of the school principal or something, they get an opportunity to correct it. They don't just say, sorry, you didn't, this was missing, we're converting your grants to loans. It's not simply, it's missing the deadline that has caused the problems. I think.
But that has not been the experience of Teach recipients I've
I even
talked to
have a
either.
question about that, because if you're only in year 2, and whether it was qualifying or not, that shouldn't automatically convert you because you have the
Exactly.
8-year window. So it sounds like these are things that should be taken up with FSA, because these are opportunities for accountability for the servicer.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, we really need to look at these individual circumstances because, as I said, you wouldn't be, there's an annual deadline, but we're not going to, they don't convert someone simply because they send in a form and something was missing if they otherwise send it in a timely manner. It goes back and you're given an opportunity to correct it. So we need to know more about these particular situations. But to your question, no, that would not happen here because we're proposing to do away with this annual certification deadline.
Okay, I
You
have
still
a
have to
question.
certify after each year of teaching, but there's no specific date each year by which you have to submit that.
Okay, so I have a concern with just erasing the deadline. Not saying it's not a great idea, because I actually love this, but if we say there's no deadline, right? Because the way I'm reading this, we moved kind of like from a active certification to kind of like a passive type thing. You're going to just assume they're doing what they're doing until it's too late and they can't do it. But if there's no deadline, and so at year 2, because they missed the first one, they just missed it, but they taught, but they just didn't tell you, and they missed the first one, and so they're into the middle of year 2, and they're like, oh, I probably need to do that now. It's been like 2 years. And so they submit this, and they have 2 years worth of service. Do you count the 2 years?
Yes, and in fact, that's happening now. I mean, although even now, people are supposed to certify every year. If someone doesn't 1 year, but they maybe certify in 10, so they avoid conversion, and then the next year they submit a certification that has 2 years, they're given credit for that now. So yes, they would be given
Then I
credit.
see a problem. Because if that's the case, what I'm reading, and I could be wrong, so please tell me, but what I'm reading is saying that like at some point at like maybe 4.5 years or 5 years, it's going to automatically convert because now they have no time. But what in regulation, what is to prevent them from saying, well, I only started my qualified service on year 3 and I'm 2 years in, there was no annual deadline, I haven't told you, and then you converted my loans at year 5 and I have 2 years. Does that make sense? Like I'm starting late, but without some type of accountability from the grant recipient, I feel like we could get caught into, they're using the last 4 years of their 8 years they used to fulfill their service. And so we could have already converted.
So I have another question, because for me on page 11, it says submitting upon completion of each year of service by the annual certification due date, which yesterday you said was consolidated down to October 31st. And then they have or October 1, and then you have the 30, and the 30. So isn't that actually the certification due date?
No, well, that's now, but remember that we're thinking that those words should not be there because there's no other reference in these right to an annual
We don't-
It's,
certification date.
okay, because
We don't
it's in
propose.
red on page 11 that it was
Yeah.
added in. Did I just miss that you're trying to remove it?
We're going to remove that
Yes.
language from, what we talked
Okay.
about in regard to the October 1 date was our interim
Just-
step,
We're standardizing
The-
the annual
Okay.
certification.
interim
date
step
to
that we announced in
simplify it, so-
December,
Okay, okay,
to have a standardized date.
okay.
And there won't be a formal date if these regs, as we've proposed here, were to be approved and get published beginning July 1, 2020, there would not be a formal drop-dead date.
But that informal suggested deadline, or however you want to call it, you're going to continue on with those October dates, or no, those would disappear. So this is just in the interim.
No, I mean, once these new regulations go into effect, no, there would no longer be this would go away. But
So there
but-
wouldn't. So no one would be provided any singular date.
No, they're going to be getting, the intent is that they would be regularly reminded of their service obligation and reminded that if you're teaching, you need to let us know after every year. But the grant recipient also has some responsibility to understand the service obligation and to do what they agreed to do when they signed the agreement to serve, which is to teach and to let us know when they did it. I do understand your point. I think the dilemma is if you set a deadline, what is the consequence for missing the deadline? And if you say the consequence is we convert your grants to loans, then we're right back where we are now.
Is there an interim consequence? Like a penalty fee or something like that? Does it have to be converted loan?
I don't know that we could do
don't have
anything
any
like that, and I
authority
think there have been suggestions to maybe only convert some of your loans, but I don't think the way the statute is written that
Well,
we can do
might I suggest, just thinking off the top of my head, I strongly feel like there needs to be a deadline. Because otherwise you're going to get to year 8 and they're going to come at you and say, well, I did it at year 2 and I did it, took another year off and I did year 3 and then took 2 years off and I did 6 and 7. You know, like they,
So you suggest maybe put a deadline in there, but maybe without a
well, put a deadline in there.
consequence?
No.
I'm
Put
thinking
a
you're
deadline.
saying something more
Or-
like, with the, all of this with the caveat that if we don't receive all of your related service certifications by X date, which would be the date by which everything would otherwise convert or something like that.
Well, I would suggest something along
You
the
see what I'm
lines
saying?
of, yeah, we have like a passive thing saying that, maintain qualified employment within the time frame that would allow you to complete your service obligation under the years. Not only maintain, but notify. Like, you have to notify me in the first 4 years that
That's
you've
what-
done
yeah,
something.
that was sort of the idea, exactly.
So it's not like an annual deadline, but in the first 4 years, I should have heard from you, or I'm going to assume you cannot complete.
Right. I
Does
know
that
what you're
make
trying to
sense?
get at.
I get what you're saying. I tend to agree that there has to be a clear deadline by which teachers have to submit their paperwork. I say that because I have a teacher that I spoke with, Victoria Libsack, who says explicitly, after graduation, I filled the teach grant requirement and got a job as an ELA teacher to teach English language learners in a Title I school in South Phoenix. I worked hard to ensure the best education for my students. Like all teachers, my first year of teaching was stressful and overwhelming. And then she still submitted her paperwork for that qualifying year on the last day that it was due, okay? She did it. And then on August 4th, 2014, she was struck with a hard blow in her first year of teaching. Not only was I underpaid, overworked, new teacher, but now I had a loan and an interest accrued, and I had over $20,000 to pay back. And I couldn't believe it. It must have been a mistake. How could the Department of Education do this to me as a teacher? So I called the Department of Education and Fed Loan Servicing every day during her prep period, and she was told that her grant was converted because of the late submission of the certification of teaching. And so I think we want to make it very clear exactly when the certification is due, to count the year, but I also think we want it in regulatory language to say if there is a error on the form, you have 60 days to fix it, and make it very clear here, because I'm not sure where the miscommunication was, but obviously this poor Miss Libsack suffered a conversion.
But I
that
want to
wasn't
challenge you on something.
correct.
When you have 60 days to correct it,
Mm-hmm.
if she sends in her idea of a correction on day 60, and on day 61 it's determined it's not sufficient, where do we draw that line? That's kind of like the verification thing. Like, where do we draw the line to say, we've given you all these cushions? So, like, even if we say
Yeah,
at year
I see what
4,
you're saying.
at year 4, you have to tell us something. Well, you've had 4 years. If you tell me at year 4 and day 1, how much leniency do I, as Ed, how much leniency do I give? Do I give you another 60 days and then you tell me on day 61? You know what I'm talking about? Like,
Yeah.
at some point, it's got to be generous. It's got to be acceptable. Maybe it shouldn't be like I think you were the one telling us that random times of the year, random people are certified. Maybe that was all just a little chaotic, but that was in the past. But going forward, I think we need a deadline. I think it needs to be firm. I think it needs to be generous. I think there needs to be, much like what we talked about, the 30, 30, 30, you have 90 days. But again, I'm getting back to my passion. My passion is the counseling, right? We went through mine yesterday. Today, Rick Harris. But at that counseling, they have to understand, we have to find a better way than web-based click, click, click to make them understand your first year is going to be crazy. You're going to forget everything I said. But what you cannot forget, $20,000 mistake is, you've got to do it before year 4. You've got to tell them before year 4, not, oh, you have 4 years. You see what I'm talking about? Like,
No, I think we get what you're talking about. You can't wait until 4 years have passed and then send us something. So maybe require that, we're doing away with the whole certification of intent. But we're going to say, if you're doing what you agreed to do and you're teaching, you've got to give us some documentation of that at some point. You're supposed to do it every year. But at a minimum, you've got to do it before you get to a certain point. And is that what you're suggesting?
My other sort of
I think so. I
corollary-
think
Go ahead.
maybe the word is recommendation. We recommend you do it annually. Kind of like an update with your servicer or something.
I think
But are we really saying that the critical year is the 4th year? I mean, that's the year that if you don't have all of your stuff in by then, that's the year. So would it make sense to do something, and this is just to your point, like how do you make that a little bit less burdensome in terms of the crazy of the first year, for instance, but at the same time provide the student with some hard, firm deadlines, and I'm just trying to come up with alternative ways of looking at it. So what if it was something like, up until the first years 1 through 3, whatever those happen to be, because they could be coming in year 5 and 6 for all we know, right? Those you can submit pretty much at any time. But if you're on that 4th year, that's the critical year. That's the one that's going to be the trigger point.
But that year shifts for students who have, focusing too much on year 4 could then confuse the
Okay.
student who, do you
So
see
how
what I
would you-
mean?
Yeah,
So-
I do. That's why I'm trying to come up with a
Yeah.
yes. Like, so how would you do that?
I don't
How
know,
could
and I
you do
think
that?
using the word recommend is very bad with students. They don't hear anything after you say the
No,
word
no.
recommend.
That's true too.
And I would really suggest, and maybe this whole section is a really great opportunity to perhaps allow all of us to step back and sort of imagine how we would envision this whole process. And from our perspective, I think we're interested in thinking about a grace period where the department or the servicer would let the individual know that their loan is about to be converted within a certain amount of time, and then that individual would then have the opportunity in that time period to then provide some sort of documentation to counter that out. That may be, thinking about some of these things a little more conceptually, may allow space to think about some of these very nitty-gritty minor issues that I think we run into as we go word for word on some of this. But
So are you suggesting maybe that, because everybody's service obligation period is going to be different depending on when it started and whether they had suspensions. So are you suggesting that for an individual grant recipient, when you're approaching the time when they're getting close to running out of time to do the 4 years, that they be sent something saying, basically in other words, you're running out of time and you've got until this date to give us some documentation showing that you've been satisfying the service obligation? Is that kind of what you're suggesting?
Yes, and I think across the board for a variety of different scenarios, that sort of model may fit a number of different cases because it provides notice and time and hopefully also instructions on how to remedy the situation. And then from there, you can think about, we can think about what happens then if it's converted and things like that. But
how is that
So-
different from the grace period you were describing?
I think that is the grace.
That is
So
the
it's
grace period.
okay.
yes.
So you're thinking something along the lines, in my head, what I'm hearing is, and I'm pretty literal with this one, but at anniversary year 1, I know it's different for different, but I've graduated, I went into basically repayment, right? So I'm going to pay with service or I'm going to pay with cash, one of the two. I'm going into repayment. Anniversary year 1, I haven't heard from you. Ed, saying I haven't heard from you. If you're performing service for repayment, for loan, teach grant, then please let us hear from you so we can adequately credit your account for your service years. If not, please let us know what your intent is or update your address or anything like that. Just a suggestion. No, I'm not saying you penalize them, but if they don't, that's that. But just let us know something. Year 2, notify them again. You're in the second year. Just annually. It doesn't have to be like all at the very last 90 days, but annual notification. I haven't heard from you. If you're performing the service, it's a great idea to tell us. If not, give us an update.
And I think this would be a good place also to incorporate the information about voluntary conversion if you know you're not going to
And
be able to
suspension.
complete.
And suspension and anything,
Right.
any other benefits that they may take advantage of.
So it sounds like from what I'm hearing, that's a little bit distinct from the 30-day grace period, which I think is a great idea because before anyone's converted, they would have the opportunity to submit documentation. This is more, here's where you are in the program, here's what information we have that you've submitted and what counts and what doesn't, and you have X amount of time left, and that would be an algorithm that would be automated. So it would also accommodate students who may have had their clock changed over time, or students that re-enter. It would be able to account for those changes.
I don't
as
think
well.
they have to exist separately.
I don't think so.
Right. I
Right.
think
Yeah.
that's more of a notice every year. But then also, I think regardless of any scenario under the sun, if your grant is about to be converted to a loan, I think we should think strongly, and I would strongly encourage support of a grace period where it would just be standard across the board. And I think that would also hopefully alleviate some frustration if, in some of these circumstances you're talking about, it really would allow for this advance notice and time for preparation. I then think there should be, and we've suggested this too, a 60-day window then to correct any errors, submit documentation. Obviously these things take time, but if you do not answer within that 30-day window, then it's converted, or if you acknowledged or whatever.
So wait, is it a 30-day or a 60-day grace?
So what this is something that we're suggesting is a 30-day grace period, and then you would have 60 days from such notification to correct any errors.
So you're notified 30 days prior to it going into a loan?
Right.
I would almost say it should be 60 days
Okay.
prior.
Sure.
Just
Yeah. That was just a
because that would be
concept.
very scary. Like if I get a letter saying I've got a month, I'm going to probably freak out a little.
Well, and I'm thinking too, depending on the time of year, that could be very stressful. for
Yeah, and then
teachers.
if they do
Yep,
need to get
100%.
forms and signatures and their superintendent maybe isn't around or whatever.
Yeah, I think we were just thinking about that in concept, so I
Because
think
if it's
we're not
June,
opposed
nobody's
to
there. But another thing I want to add to that is I would even suggest that it's longer, because if I'm going to be notifying them, you told me to dream, so this is my sandbox right here. If I'm going to say I'm going to notify them annually, then that last year, year 4 basically, I haven't heard from them at all. And in year 4, I'm going to amp it up. I'm going to notify them at 6 months. I'm going to notify them at 3 months. Then I'm getting into my 30 days and saying it's going to happen. And then have some type of, I would love for this to be, dreaming now, but I would love for this to be somewhere on a database that counselors can see, so that the service, or everybody can see, like, as this communication goes. We have a software system that does this for us, and it is priceless. It is, the benefit is just undescribable, because I can go back to a student and say, we sent this letter to this email to this address 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 6 months ago, 30 days ago. And for us, with face-to-face contact with these students, if we could help Ed say, this is where they sent it, this is where you told them your address was, this was your email address, they've sent it to you 7 times. So then when they do come to Kira with a letter, she has access to say, they did communicate with you. Now, if it's a bad address, we got to have the student be responsible for that.
Couple of things. There is an annual notification requirement built into the regulation, which we haven't talked about yet. It doesn't include, it's more general, it doesn't include, from what I can tell, these regs don't contemplate specific information about where this individual borrower or teacher is at this point. And it's possible, that could be built in. There would be some concerns from FSA on how much it would cost us in terms of contracting, but, that's if the decision is made to do that. It's also important to keep in mind that, we have a lot of experience on this on income-based repayment, where borrowers have to provide us income annually. We start sending them notices 90 days before that deadline. We send them 90 days, we send them 60 days, we send them 30 days, we send them when the deadline is over, we send it after. Our response rate on those is horrendous. We don't get the information. So, we've gotten to the point where we're trying to work it out with IRS that we can get the information directly. So no matter how much...
Which we really appreciate that effort, by the way. Sidetrack, very strongly in favor of that.
No matter how much we can't, as you've been saying, you could, if you could go down, people will not respond. It may be better on this because it's one thing with income information versus, well, I'm teaching, that's pretty much public anyway. And
Similarly with the income-driven repayment plans, you're right. They don't respond until they don't give us the information, and then their payment is recalculated and it goes up. That's what gets their attention. Just it's not as drastic a consequence as having your
It's the same with it's the same with just federal student aid administrators. I mean, the missing dot thing. It's not until they can't register the next semester and they don't have they didn't pay last semester. That's when when it hits them. But I'm thinking more along the communication to them. I'm thinking of that as just a better service. Just because it's Friday afternoon, I'm very comfortable. But just to keep Kira happy. I'm talking about, like, she would have the documentation so that when this person does complain, even if they're doing it through IBR, it's like, we did our part. Right now, that's not necessarily easy to defend. So, but if we had the communication out there, we can say, we did exactly what we said, and we did our good faith to do that. Not saying you're not doing your good faith, but it's just a lot easier to track, and it's a whole lot easier for all of us to get behind you when we can see it happening, and help out.
But it also gives someone like Miss Libsack, who had her grant converted purely due to a service year form, right? That should not have converted, the opportunity to go back before it converts and say, no, I still have 7 years left in my service obligation. Like, this should not convert. You are making an error-fed loan. And hopefully, if there's better information available on the FSA website and on the ED website about the dispute process, then she would be able to raise it. So that now, she's been in the position where she's been paying this off for 4 years, even though she had every intention of complying with the service requirement.
Yeah, I mean, some of that, what you're describing there really clearly is either Ed needs to go back and look at how they've told FedLoan to do this, because I've been stuck, even though listening to this conversation, around the fact that that's year one, you have 8 years total. And so what's happening there? So I think, again, we have opportunities, whether it's through this regulation or just because you guys get to take this back and say, oh my God, we heard about this all day long, is holding the servicer accountable. Because that to me is not that unique of a story of all the stories that are out there about the Teach grants. And I'm not sure how what the communication is, or how these things are laid out, what script is written or what, but it's happening. And it seems like you guys get that to some degree because you're doing this reconciliation process. But certainly as we move forward, while it may not be in the purview for us to say, this is what you say to whomever you contract this with, that the oversight of the servicers, in fact, not just for this, but for all servicing of federal student financial aid, needs to be more deeply incorporated to the practice of the department, because it's been going on. It happens with other servicers as well in different ways. And it's just very clear that it's not Ed's intention to have this unfold this way. It's not the student's intention to have these things unfold. And it's at the servicer's point, because to some degree it is in the financial benefit of the servicer to convert, because they make more money when they're servicing a loan. In particular, in this case, for sure, they make more money when they're servicing than when they're holding the Teach grant and dealing with it. Some would say even that possibly the servicer sees themselves as losing money, because nothing's coming in except paperwork and work for them unless you start to service a loan instead of the grant. It's been on my mind, can you tell, even on a Friday afternoon.
So,
So, go ahead.
so, I very much appreciate, I've been a teacher, to know that it's challenging first year or any year really of teaching. I'm hesitant to put out there that we would do any of what we're talking about because it's so overwhelming to be a teacher. That to me is not compelling reason for doing any of what we're talking about. I think it actually potentially infantilizes teachers and says, you're so overwhelmed, you can't possibly do X, Y, or Z. And they do X, Y, or Z. They pay their rent, they pay their car insurance and such. And it goes back to, those are triggered by a bill. And so I go back to something I think I heard you say, Debbie, before. Could it be that there's a bill and there are ways to pay? So how are you paying? You're paying through service, intent to service. Like to me, that's how everything else operates, is you get a bill, you pay. And it's regular, there's a date, they're also with that too. And if you miss it by this window, there's this fee, there's this window, there's that fee. I mean, to me, that's just how everything else operates. Why would we do this differently than other things? Maybe there's a reason why, but.
I think I can say I was surprised by the annual certification of an intent to do something I already intended to do. If I knew that my year wasn't going to qualify, it's not intuitive to do that at all. And in that way, it is distinct from paying the rent, because it is intuitive to pay the rent every month. You sign the lease, you know exactly when you're going to have to pay. I think here, on one hand, I think I agree with you that, teachers have to be notified, but I think that is sort of the idea of giving them notice in advance of the conversion and sending them an annual reminder is also at times, depending on the delay of some of this stuff, maybe letting them know how what they've submitted has been counted or not as well. And so it's not so much infantilization of the teacher, although, I hear your concerns on that front. It's more making sure that they have the opportunity to check how everything is being counted or not.
Well, and that's what a bill would do, is it would say, so we got this payment from you, again, payment in terms of service or whatever, we got this payment from you last year, this is what's due now, this is what's due in the future, kind of like a house loan. You have the whole history in the future is like right there every month. Mm-hmm. There's no confusion because it's just right there.
Go ahead.
I really like that idea. And I'm even thinking, like the communication, annual communication. I don't necessarily think it needs to be just a form letter, because they're going to trash it. They're not going to read it. We've already talked about that. They're not going to read it. But if it does resemble type of like, this is your commitment. You have 4 years of service. You've used year 1. Would you like to use service for that? Submit these documents.
Right.
Would you like to use that as one of your, and we can name it better, but term it as an off year? Then we're going to assume this is an off year unless we hear from you. Year 2 comes around, same thing. You know, you've used year 2. Would you like to use this as your off year, or would you like to use a service year to meet this? And even have on there the monetary amount,
Yes.
because that's what drives them, as we've all discussed. Money drives them. So I owe $16,000 at the end of my time as undergrad. Then here's your $16,000 bill. Would you like to use 1 year of service? Send me the documents. Maybe it has to be that simple.
Let me just say that they're actually, they do get something like that now. If they're actually, they get letters saying you've satisfied X number of years, you have X number of years to go. So they're already getting that. But it's tied to this annual certification date. So that's already kind of happening. But, and as you'll see, as Brian mentioned earlier, when we get a little further on, we do talk about how the secretary will at least annually notify the grant recipient of various things, including how much time you have left to do this. And so we already, as I said, we're already doing something like this, so it really wouldn't be a big change to say, here's what you've done so far, here's how much you have to do, and here's how long you have to do it. I think that the question I think we're still debating is whether there needs to be some kind of deadline for doing it and what the consequence should be for missing that.
To that end, I guess, back to my whole struggle with at the end of year 1, you don't file your paperwork and so you're converted. Why do we have to assume that there needs to be some sort of consequence? And maybe I'm just asking that because if really kind of what's happening, like I was going to agree, just like Debbie here, to say that's a really nice idea to lay it out. I was going to recommend, even this may be a stretch, I don't know, it shouldn't be too hard, this is how much interest has accrued should your grant convert later that gets added on. So it's now 16.5, 16.8, whatever. And even include, if at this point in time you're not going to complete your teaching, the service component, the voluntary conversion, and state why. Because if you convert now, your principal is lower, and therefore, you will be paying back less, depending on other things, of course, all math aside. And having that be the communication and giving them a deadline. If you don't hear from them by then you see it in the next year. This, just like Debbie was saying, this is year 2, we haven't heard from you, so we assume you're not teaching, here's your interest, your blah, 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 blah. And so that there's no sort of stick, if that makes sense. I don't know.
I totally agree. I have no problem with a sort of enhanced notification, right? I do have a problem if we're tying that notification to some sort of penalty. Especially when they still have the 8 years to fulfill their obligation. Like, that to me is just not fair. And I also think, I understand, I would like to also discuss some of the nitty gritty, because I think the more clear we can make our regulations on what the timeline is on these, on what has to be submitted after that first year of service, may help clear up some of these things. And I understand the idea that the notification should be formatted like a bill, and so I really like the idea of having the interest and having information about a voluntary conversion. But again, I would just strongly caution us not to penalize folks, teach recipients, who have every ambition to fulfill their service obligation, and cut them off at the knees before they've had the opportunity to demonstrate that they're going to fulfill their obligation.
And I would just add that I really like the idea of the bill too, an invoice. I mean, we don't trigger anything in our head without an invoice, right? But I think also the listing of what the anticipation is, anticipated remedy is important. You talked about having first service being the first listing, the second listing being that we're taking that time off, right? and then going down the list with the penalty being the very least, the very last on the list, which I think is important because otherwise we know that you've already mentioned how inundated teachers are with other things. A lot of them are only going to read those things that are listed first. They're only going to take from that form what the intent is based on how that information is listed. And so I would only add that we need to be very intentional in how that form is put together and have the listing with the least amount of penalty at the beginning.
So I'm just wondering, since we're talking about putting all this stuff into a notification of some sort, whether we want to look at what we've got here for the notifications and then see what we want to do with that. Does that make sense?
The only thing I wanted to add to that is if we are going to somehow regulate that a bill be sent, I would want to add it into entrance counseling, that it be told to students up front that you will receive a bill regarding your service obligation or your payment or work obligation or something like that, so that they begin to conceptualize that this grant comes with a bill. Because I think that'll be very confusing if it's not explained right up front.
It's not a bill.
Like, yeah.
It's just the formatting of the notification is akin to what you would receive if you had a bill. So it's not a literal bill.
It's not a literal bill that they have to respond to. Like, it's not formatted in such a way that it triggers in their brain the same type of reaction that we would have, that, oh, this is something that requires my attention and my focus. And bills are usually the thing that do that for us the most. Is that sort of, David, what you were working on hinting at?
Exactly. So maybe an exit counseling. I mean, I don't do counseling, so I don't know, but somewhere, right, they should know to expect this thing that looks like a bill, even if it's not a bill.
And it would be amazing if, as counselors, we had a copy of the format so that we could actually present it with exit counseling to say, this is serious. You know, this is not just another, hey, consolidate all your loans and win a bread box. This is serious.
And I can't remember who mentioned it first, but somebody said that it was really notification. And as I would like us to use that terminology as it relates to it, but I totally agree. I think looking like a bill and indicating that there is some obligation that you've agreed to, and this is the offset of that, is a great notification of exactly where they are in the process each year.
I just wonder if sending something that looks like a bill to a student, they're going to be more inclined to ignore that anyway.
I was thinking
Just
maybe
throwing that idea out there.
the other way to
maybe
another way to look at it would be like an account update, like you get from your bank. Now, granted, not everybody looks at that with deep focus either. I agree, but maybe it's your obligation update or your obligatory account update or something that ties it back to the obligation that you agreed to, gives you the full understanding of what's happening. But again, I don't think this should be 10 pages long either. As we draft this should be something that is maybe, ideally in the world, it would be 1 page, but maybe 2 pages that has all of this information so that it's with appropriate links and such as needed for them to reference to, because any longer than that and they're gone, because we would be gone.
I understand. Thanks. I understand some of the sentiment around the bill idea, and I think that's great and all well and good. I don't know exactly what wording we'll end up actually putting in the regulation. I think some of this will have to be up to FSA and the sort of implementation of some of this regulatory language. Perhaps it's better as we think about what might be best to think about consumer testing and ensuring that some of these forms go out for comment or something along those lines is something that I think may be a better path to go down than saying in the regulation somehow like expect something that kind of looks like a bill or I don't know whatever we end up thinking, but just something to keep in mind.
We currently have it as notifications. That's why I was suggesting we can look at it and see what does this, how close is it to what we're already
And just
talking
to
about.
to expand a bit on what I said before, I'm pretty sure that they already get, the notices that they get, as they do include the amount of interest they could potentially have to pay. So we're already doing something like that. Arguably, I think these communications could be a little more clearly written, and we're going to be working on that. So they're already doing something like this. I think that it would be a matter of changing the timing of when these things are sent out. So something like this is actually already in place.
So let's review what we've got here as potential notifications that, and see what else we want to do here, if anything. So again, we specify at least annually during the service obligation period, we will notify the grant recipient of the terms and conditions that the grant recipient must meet to satisfy the service obligation, the requirement for the grant recipient to provide to the secretary, upon completion of each of the 4 required elementary or secondary academic years of teaching service, documentation of that teaching service on a form approved by the secretary and certified by the chief administrative officer of the school or educational service agency in which the grant recipient taught.
Can we stop there before we go
Yes.
further? So I would like to define completion of each academic year of service, because I will tell you I have heard of forms that have gotten rejected and folks have not had the opportunity to complete them because it fell after that their very firm deadline. Their correction was received afterwards, was accepted, but then was rejected because it was received after their certification deadline. What that means, so for some schools, they have professional development after the last day students are present. For other schools, they might think of the end of the school year as the last day that they receive their employment check that covers the previous year's contract. So how do we define that time?
Isn't there a definition of it in the way front?
No.
We have a definition of academic year or its equivalent for elementary and secondary schools in the actual CFR. I'll read you what it is.
But so I see that on page 2, the
Right.
1 complete school year
Yes.
or 2 complete. However, that doesn't clarify what counts as the last day of school for a teacher who's trying to submit the form. So
Okay, but again, if I could ask, are we talking about the current situation where people are missing deadlines, or are we talking about going forward?
Yeah.
We erased the deadline, so
no,
going
I'm
forward.
not talking about that date. I'm talking about for a teacher filling out the form, which says what was the last day of school. That even that has been a point of contention, that no one really knows what the last day of school is under the way that these regulations have been written, which may then impact their timeline on 1, whether or not the form is accepted, and 2, when they would even submit the form.
But the school years always have an official starting date and an ending date. So I'm not sure that I understand where the...
And
For
actually,
students, but not always for teachers.
But, and maybe this isn't specific enough, but this is actually fairly flexible. It says 1 complete school year or 2 complete consecutive half years from different school years, excluding summer sessions, which generally fall within a 12-month period. So it is pretty flexible. And there's more to it, I'm just...
So then maybe this is just a point for how the form.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe this
is
goes back
sound
to the
regulatory,
form.
Yeah, and there's actually more to it. It says, if a school has a year-round program of instruction, a secondary considers a minimum of 9 consecutive months to be the equivalent of an academic year. It doesn't, it's pretty flexible, actually.
It sounds like this goes back to the servicer.
This is true.
And how the servicer has interpreted the school year, and therefore it goes back to the form. So it sounds like the forms require a lot of
And
attention in this, in
would-
the issue you're describing.
To add on to that, I think the current form is set up so that the chief administrative officer actually, I believe, lists specific dates of employment as a teacher, and that has sometimes caused some problems. So we were actually in the process of developing new forms to go through OMB clearance when it was determined that we were going to potentially revise the regulations, so we pulled back on that because it made no sense to proceed with that, because whatever we do here could make those forms obsolete. To address that issue, what we were proposing to do was to, instead of having the chief administrative officer certify specific dates of employment, it would simply be certifying that you had completed the 2018-2019 school year to get away from those dates. So that was the
That'd be
direction we were going.
Okay.
So.
And then with the chief administrative officer, how is that defined? Because I've also heard from teachers, I mean, oftentimes in these schools, there can be a lot of turnover in the administrative staff. If you don't have a principal present, if you don't have a vice principal present, who would certify the form?
Well, it's a term that we also use for other programs, like teacher loan forgiveness, and we define it on the forms. It does not have a regulatory definition anywhere, I don't think. It's basically, and it's going to vary from school to school. In some places it may be the principal, in some places it may be at the district level, it could be someone in the HR office. It's basically, I don't have the verbiage here from the form, but it's whoever is authorized to verify your employment and has access to the records that show that you met all of the qualifications, but that could be different depending on the school.
Are we good? So, 3, Romanet 3, the time frame within which the teach grant recipient must complete the service obligation. I think we all just discussed that. The conditions under which the grant recipient may request a temporary suspension of the period for completing the service obligation. The conditions under, and just stop me if there's any point we want to discuss more. The conditions under which each grant amounts dispersed to the recipient will be converted to a direct unsubsidized loan with interest accruing from the date that each grant disbursement was made.
Can we actually stop there? Because this assumes the conditions under which will be converted. Can we just say what the condition would be? It'd be if you reach a point where you can no longer fulfill your service obligation within the 8 years, unless you have a.
I think leaving it this way would allow for an explanation of voluntary conversion.
A voluntary conversion, or just, I would, in the interest of clarity, to just make it as clear as possible so that we prevent some of these misinterpretations on the servicer side who are also relying on these regulations. Ooh. I would want to clarify that it's either through voluntary conversion or through if you do not fulfill, if you reach a point where it becomes impossible for you to fulfill your 4-year service obligation.
I'm just wondering, and I'm not saying this could ever happen, but what if suddenly other conditions materialized? Wouldn't we want to keep this language more flexible? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I don't think that those conditions, this is just saying the notice will explain the conditions, and those conditions will be whatever conditions are in effect under the regulations at that time. So the actual notice that goes out will say if you voluntarily request it, if you run out of time, or if we establish some other condition, it would list that. So I don't think that needs to be here.
I disagree, because if you were going to rework the obligations to repay the grant, you'd have to have this whole section go through neg reg anyway. This notification provision is within the obligations to repay the grant. If you're going to change when the obligations would arise, you'd have to renegotiate the whole section anyway.
Can you explain why you think that in this section where we're describing the contents of the notice, we need to say, would it help just to add a cross-reference here to say the conditions under which the grants will be converted to loans as described in, would that take care of it?
you're referencing the same, you're referencing A1 and A1. I mean, we may need to break this piece, an obligation to repay the grant and the notification, into two separate sections.
Yeah, I think some of this has been going on throughout this.
Yeah.
I mean, even though it's titled obligation to repay the grant, what 2 is specifically addressing is exactly what's in the notice.
Right.
There, as the
No,
department's
yeah.
proposing. So it's this is all considered part of the obligation because you're in the period of repayment of, at this point in time when you're receiving these notices. Anybody correct me where? You mean your fan base?
Good, thank God my mic wasn't on then. Now I've forgotten what, no, sorry for not turning on my mic, but number 2 is just about the process of making sure that the individual is aware at all points along the way. Well, in this case, not all points, but annually they're aware of where they stand.
Yes.
In the obligation to repay.
Yes, but if we're talking about the obligation would change over time, what I'm saying is this whole section would be considered in a subsequent negotiated rulemaking to redefine what the obligations are to repay. All I'm saying is instead of leaving it unclear to say explicitly, your grant will only convert through voluntary conversion, or if you do not fulfill, if you reach the point of impossibility for you to fulfill your 4 service years within your service clock.
I think that's not necessarily true because somebody could fulfill it but just never communicate. So if we leave it that specific, then they could communicate 20 years later and say, "Oh, but I did it."
Okay, subject to adding. But you see what I'm saying, right? Like adding the paperwork. All I'm saying is to make it as clear as possible in these regulations, so that it is clear exactly when your grant will convert across the board.
And
that's all.
I do agree with you that it needs to be clear. I mean, I'm the one at the table that always says we just got to beat every detail in there. But again, when we're talking, as my peers, you all trained me yesterday, when we're talking regulation versus the form, maybe that is addressed at the form level and at the regulation level. I mean, I just really don't see the difference between addressing the details here versus when we were talking about the exit counseling and the entrance counseling. Like, yes, I want every bit of it in there, but if we put it in there, then it's just tying us down to where we can adjust the forms. And when we get to the form level, we get to look at that, and yes, we get every detail on there.
I guess I'm still not clear on why we would need to add those conditions, those specific conditions here, because this is just saying the notice that we send will include this information. One of those pieces of information is the conditions for loan conversion. Those are specified up here, so the actual notice will say your grants will be converted if you ask us to or if you run out of time. But we don't really need to put that information. We're not losing anything if we don't repeat that information here because it's already in the earlier paragraph into this section.
Let me think on it a little bit further. I mean, it is truly an excess of caution to make sure it is as clear as possible at every point to make sure that none of these inadvertent conversions happen. I hear what you're saying, that it is duplicative of what is stated earlier. But at the same time, if we can condense it down and make it really clear again, then that would be the language that would be copy-pasted by other institutions and used by other folks. So I'll think on it.
Okay. 3. The teach grant amounts disbursed to a recipient are converted to a direct unsubsidized loan. Oh, excuse me. If the teach grant amounts disbursed to a recipient are converted to a direct unsubsidized loan, the Secretary notifies the recipient of the conversion and explains that the recipient will receive a 6-month grace period before he or she enters repayment on the direct unsubsidized loan, that the recipient has the option of paying the interest that has accrued since the date of each teach grant disbursement, and that any unpaid interest will be capitalized at the end of the 6-month grace period, and this should be dropped, but it's not, that once a teach grant has been converted to a direct unsubsidized loan, it cannot be converted to a grant unless the grant was converted to a loan in error. And
Before we move, just because it's a quick fix and it's the one I
Yes.
keep harping on.
Yes.
The error verbiage.
Yeah.
yes, thank you. Yes.
Does the interest capitalize currently within 6 months?
Yes.
It's not paid, which is basically the same thing that happens with a regular direct unsubsidized loan at the end of the grace period if you don't pay.
All unsubsidized loans. So by turning it to an unsubsidized loan, it behaves as an unsubsidized loan.
Correct.
And you always have the option to pay the interest before it capitalizes.
Which is why your students
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, their principal is increasing exponentially. I mean,
Yep.
Yes, actually.
which I just want to say is why counseling is so important.
yeah.
Y'all have us so
So if that has to remain because that is just how direct unsubsidized loans function, I do believe that informing students that their interest will be capitalized is critical at each point because we haven't.
Would you like a
included it
job?
so far? I mean, ooh.
We spend lots of our time doing that.
But I think in terms of the written documentation, when we've been talking about entrance and exit counseling, we've been talking about retroactive interest. We have not included that it will be capitalized in this.
Oh,
rulemaking.
if it's not in here, it's definitely in the actual counseling tools, including examples of what that looks like.
Yeah.
One thing I'd like to put on the table, sort of while we're on this topic, is one thing that we've discussed in our office is considering some sort of additional counseling for a student who has their loan converted. Some sort of, I don't know exactly what it would look like, but it would be an opportunity to discuss and remind the borrower, the now borrower, of some of the standard items that we think about as we think about unsubsidized loans, one in particular being the availability of public service loan forgiveness and other options. I don't know exactly how we might get about doing that, but a touch point to provide that counseling for what they now have.
It's kind of like entrance counseling, right? Like you're about to be a borrower.
Well, and I mean, that's, like I said, again, my soapbox is the counseling. I would just really love to hear what everyone has to say when we come back in February about how we can do counseling better, because I don't have any ideas. You know, you can talk to them when they're 18 years old at entrance counseling. You get to talk to them again as they're trying to get graduation parties scheduled and their break visit, trip, what are they going to do with their spring break and their senior year. You get to talk to them then, and then you don't talk to them again. And it's really, really, at neither one of those times do you have their attention. Just to be honest with you, you don't have their attention. And it's even worse when it's web-based, because all they're doing is just meeting whatever you put in front of them and just to get out of the way. And so if anybody has any ideas on how we can do a good job of counseling them, I don't know how you would get attention of somebody who's waited 5 years and just done nothing on their teach grant. How would you get their attention to counsel them? You couldn't get their attention the first 5 years. I don't know how you do that, but I would just love to hear what the committee has to say, because to me, that's the turnaround in every bit of this. Because if they knew that the interest was retroactive and capitalized, and they knew what that looked like, and they knew what that monthly payment's going to increase, and they knew what their rent was, their car note is, and how that's going to impact them, I don't think they would make the same decisions. But then it's too late by the time, I think Brian's the one that said when they get the bill in, you know, it's too late. And so I just really, counseling to me is the catalyst here.
That kind of leads into my concern as I'm reading this section. This is the annual notification part. And it then for 3 and the 4 subsets of that 3, that's if it So it's kind of interesting to me because this I feel like should be a separate, it should be pulled out of the annual notification because it's a lot of detail and it's important, but this is around very specifically if the loan converts. And so I feel like 3 should be its own sort of notification, all of that information, and what goes out annually are things like
It is its own notification. It may be that the distinction in the regs isn't as clear, but
Yeah, it's
2,
not.
The title of the section is obligation to repay
oh, and
the
then
grant.
3 is the whole new
2
set.
is the
Okay.
annual notification, and 3 is if it's converted.
So maybe when we
So it may
talk
not
about-
be as distinct.
So then can we add
Yeah, I was
30
gonna
days
say-
before the Teach Grant amounts dispersed to a recipient are converted to a direct unsubsidized loan, the secretary will notify, or 60 days?
I would say
Yeah.
greater than 30, especially if we're going to allow for these, I'll call them late certification of service years.
Sure. Sure. So at the beginning of 3 here, so at least 90?
I would be comfortable with 90, and I think that would give, if this is the event that triggers some action, I think 90 days should be sufficient to get everything submitted.
And number 2, we began with at least annually. So for consistency on number 3, can we maybe say something like at least 60 days
90
prior
days,
to
yeah.
conversion?
I like 90 days.
90
Yeah,
days,
I
at
agree.
least 90 days prior to conversion. And so that kind of gives us a little window if they want to do 120 days.
Well,
90
here's the
days.
thing with that. By saying at least 90, again, thinking from the student's perspective, if I send them something that says a year from now we're going to convert your loan, they're going to ignore that too. Because a year in the mind of a freshly graduated student seems like an eternity, even though us older folks know that it's really not.
I would also add that if it's a self-conversion, you couldn't do it.
You
90
couldn't
days
do it at
in
all.
advance.
So
yeah,
what I would recommend is saying, because you don't want to say exactly 90 days, so something like between 120 and 90 days prior to a non-self conversion or something like that.
Involuntary
Yeah,
conversion.
involuntary.
To a, non-voluntary. Non-voluntary.
Involuntary.
Yeah, and, thank you.
Well, even
My brain is
I'm-
mush at this point.
I'm thinking about this, even if we go with what we're discussing earlier, if we were to do something like you're getting close to the point where you're running out of time, and we tell you you're running out of time, you've got to do something, we still don't know for a fact that you're going to be converted until you reach that point. So it might be a little difficult to put a time on this because we may not know for sure 90 days out that you're going to be converted, because you could turn in the, you see what I'm saying?
But,
It
but
may be difficult.
regardless
But-
of that, though, I mean, if nothing changes, you can also assume that they're not submitting anything.
Yeah, I would
You know,
say you keep this because this would be the fright factor that would get them to communicate with you. Because if you don't, even if you haven't heard from them and they have been doing their service for 3 or 4 years, when you send that, you may have a little bit more impact on 90 days. And they're like, oh, wait, here's all 4 years right here. But if we don't, if we just wait right up until the end, yeah, they may have already done their service, but they may not have, and now we're stuck with, again, 2 weeks from now, we're turning this around.
Yeah, and I think if they're sent this in error, it's going to cause panic, but it will also still cause that communication, which is what we're trying to jog anyway.
Although on the flip side of this, we're all thinking that they're going to get a document at, the end of year 4, which is get into your high needs school and get this teaching done, or it's going to convert. When really, if we're giving, they get that alert, this notice comes out, between 120 and 90 days of that last of the 8 years. Is that how you, assuming that everything trucks along as it is that what we want? Because then, yeah, if they have it done, great. But if not, like I think there should be I'm just, based on previous conversation, is this really when we want this?
I don't know. Thinking through it, if I haven't heard from them in 4.5 years, they would get this notice. Because I would assume, I have not heard one word. Right, because think about it, like, if I haven't heard anything, because we've sent them
Yes,
annual
that's
notices.
that's the first time a student would receive it.
Yeah,
Yes.
the first time they'll get this is like 4.5 years. And so then, like I said, the fear factor would jump in, and maybe they do submit 2 years of service. And then I'm starting not starting my clock over, but I'm counting, and it may be at year 6, at that point, they get another one.
But this says, yeah, because right now this reads are converted, or at least in 3 it says blah, 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 what we're putting in there. If amounts dispersed to a recipient are converted. So that's my concern then. We need to change that verbiage to address this, because right now this is like, hey, this is it. So I know we're trying to change things, so we just need to.
The amounts.
I see what you're saying. It's in conflict with itself.
Yes,
No.
yes, thank you.
You've changed basically what's happened here is we've changed what is a conversion subsection in 3 to a notice subsection.
Yes.
And we haven't changed the rest of the language.
Yeah,
So
'cause
basically
yes.
3, we'd replace 3
I
with
just want to make sure we
something else.
finish this
Yes.
out.
But I would also like to maintain some sort of, and we can talk about it as a group, I guess, but some sort of concept of once it is converted, if there is additional communication.
Maybe what we do instead is, instead of redrafting 3, is create a new 3 that is the notice, has in it what we would like to be there, and then keep 3 as it is with whatever changes we make moving through.
Yes.
Okay. So can we have a new 3, please? Sure. Thank you. I defer to my colleagues on what should be there.
So then, yeah, we can copy that language between cut that language.
Okay. Just the beginning.
Just the beginning, between 90 and 120 days prior to an involuntary conversion. And move that up to 3. Before the teach grants amounts to a recipient will be converted.
Just a comment here, we don't use the term involuntary conversion anymore. Maybe we would want to cross-reference the conversion due to running out of time section,
Okay.
because we don't.
So between 90 and 120 days prior to a conversion due to the reason in...
No, this isn't prior to conversion. This is 90 to 100 days prior to the last point that you have to complete your service obligation. Is that what you guys are talking about?
Yes, but which is synonymous with when it would be converted.
No, but it wouldn't necessarily be converted right then and there. I mean, because we still have to wait.
I think I would like to
Okay.
keep it
Okay.
this way because I want to threaten them with conversion.
Well, I just had a thought. I think for public service loan forgiveness, we put in the regulations, did we not, that, or maybe it's for the income-driven repayment plan, when they get to the point, nearing the point when they may get loan forgiveness, we've got some language in there that says X amount of time in advance when we expect the borrower would meet the requirements. Maybe something like that could be used as a model.
Yes, good idea.
I know that. I remember that.
From memory.
Prior to the conversion?
But just for the sake of putting it here, we can recheck, we do it, just put prior to a point in time, the secretary would expect,
The grant
the grant
recipient
recipients.
to no longer be able to complete their service obligation
Yeah.
in the time window.
We have to fix that.
Yeah, and then highlight.
We're trying to catch the
Coming back to it
concept.
Yeah.
Within the 8 years or something. Within what's left of their
8-year
8
service
years.
obligation period.
Yeah, and then highlight. We gotta figure out. I must fix this.
So what would you want to tell them then? I mean, would it stay the same?
I
with
would
the-
want to tell them everything that I told them.
Well, I would say that first, that if you have not sent in the certification of your teaching obligation, those aren't the right words that we have throughout the regs, that now you need to get that. Oh, okay, sorry. These are the, sorry. Oh, my micro. I'm creating a fan base by making sure nobody can hear me. Boy, I'm really sorry.
Okay, so we would then, this is the secretary will notify the grant recipient.
Is there going to be more than one thing included in this? Because if so,
Yeah,
I think we
feel
should,
like,
we
yeah,
should
the notified-
enumerate them.
Yeah, so grant recipient, and then maybe colon, and then,
The line, or-
yeah.
I think it looks a large A or whatever.
No, I think the way they have it, it goes to a little I. I don't,
Okay.
it doesn't seem as consistent as I would expect. It's not a legislative version. The necessity to submit paperwork or the appropriate paperwork reflecting any service obligation completion or teaching, I've forgotten what, help me out. What were the terms we were using throughout the reg? In other words, get your paperwork in if you've actually done this.
Completed prior?
Completed prior.
I mean, I will
To the
say,
state.
looking back at the service obligation, there is not a clear deadline by which they have to submit the service obligation, service obligation documentation.
Right, so
in
this
that,
is why, this is why we're saying you gotta get this in, say you just haven't talked to them in 4.5
And also-
years.
I don't
But
think we need the word prior.
Yeah, I don't think we need prior, but also I would like to add the consequences.
Oh yeah, this is just a list of things.
Yeah,
This
this is
is,
just the
this is just
beginning.
the first one.
I just don't want this one to be the warm, fluffy.
No, this is gonna lay out like,
No,
hey, get your
everything's
paper,
okay.
get your
Yeah.
paperwork in if you've done it is the first I.
I think
yeah,
it
and
should
then
include
second
this.
I, if the recipient does not submit the paperwork, their grant will convert to a loan with.
Well, this is the notice. So inside this notice, I would like for it to say, this is your interest accrued until this, up to this point.
Right, so
I-
that's
I-
what I'm saying. We're gonna get there in the, here's what you need to do to fulfill the service requirement. If you do not submit the documentation, your grant will convert to a loan. If your grant converts to a loan, it has already accrued X amount of interest. Does that address the concern?
Yeah, I'm not in love with the verbiage.
Yeah, no, I don't
think
think
this
any of
verbiage
us
sounds
are.
like the notice rather than
Yeah, I think
the
this-
regulation governing the notice.
This,
I think we're
sorry,
trying to get it in there to know.
I'm sorry, I missed what you said.
It's okay. I think we'll have time to change the verbiage anyway. I just don't
But
like
you
it.
said this sounds like a notice, and I
Yeah,
thought
rather
that.
than the regulation that would drive a notice.
Oh, gotcha. But some of this other stuff is rather scriptive too, so I think, yes, language massage, but it might be okay to have it there.
Is there anything else that we would want on this notice? Or-
See, I don't like what starts with if, and this is a regulation, and I'm reading if what. How did?
I think I like consequences of. Like, we're notifying them, right? This is the notice. So
Should
consequences.
the paperwork not be submitted, or should the service obligation, we have to figure something out about, should the paperwork not be submitted, something about the service obligation, so that the if is not there, that it's.
So the secretary will notify the grant recipient the necessity to submit the paperwork, the consequences if the recipient does not submit the paperwork,
And that may.
the consequences if the grant converts to a loan.
That's better.
I know,
I'm still not, but it's better.
but that's what we're notifying, right? Have we missed anything? We're just reading.
So I guess,
staring at- I'm
and I'm
staring at
probably
you.
just being picky, but it's not the consequences if they don't submit the paperwork. It's the consequences if they can't submit the paperwork. Because just submitting the paperwork still doesn't guarantee that,
See, I see what
The
you're
notice
saying.
that
Is unable.
yeah.
Um,
Because they could submit paperwork in desperation, that means
If-
nothing.
if paperwork, if the documentation is not received, then the secretary will consider that they have not completed their service obligation. If they do not complete their service obligation, the grant will convert. That they have not, they will not be, they have not,
Yeah, it's, you gotta carry it out
Yeah.
further there.
Because it's, they still have a chance if they, possibly, if they've done some obligation. So
Yeah.
it's not an absolute, that it converts. So, yeah, I think this is something that we probably need to take home with us and work on some language.
Definitely, because I'm also, I don't see in here where there's any deadline for requesting a suspension either. And so.
Well, that's the thing I was going to add. Is the
so
fourth one, I would like
yeah.
for this notice to even include the option to request a suspension. The secretary will notify the grant recipient of the option to,
Oh, the secretary will?
no, right there,
Oh, okay, of the option, okay.
of the option to request obligation, suspension of whatever that, I don't know how to call it. I'm like you, I don't know.
No, but there are conditions, the conditions that, under which one can request a suspension, because if we don't say that, then it sounds like, hey, I need a suspension. Please.
We have it earlier. The conditions under which the grant recipient may request a temporary suspension of the period for completing the service obligation. Yeah, is it right above it? Or go up a little bit. It's actually, well, where are we? It's, yep, there it is.
The term consequences to me is one I would like to see changed because that could be, it's quite broad. There could be lots of consequences, and we don't expect that this is, so it's the action taken regarding the loan or regarding the grant, or something like the action the secretary will take regarding the loan or loan grant. So in both places, yeah.
Right, I think the appeal information should go with the, because this is not actual conversion paperwork just yet.
yeah. But I do, I mean, I will. Appeal process with the education department for that service year form, because I could see someone saying, I submitted my service year form, it was denied on the basis of like the last day of school. And I still complied with my requirement, and it's not being counted, and now none of my 4 years have counted because of one disagreement on a.
That comes up when it gets converted. And I think that, I mean, at least in what the department is offering, like, I think if we offer an appeal process.
that, so if you put the appeals process here, that gets confusing because the first moment, this is a notification to just say, this is like the, hey, just in case you didn't get us the paperwork, get us the paperwork. And there's but if you don't, then these other, and P.S., we just want you to be aware of these other things. But then the department's drafted language about when it's converted. They even have some language on an appeals process in the offering that they have on the paper. So I think if you put in, if you mention it too soon, it just gives them another chance. Oh, well, I can just let this convert and I can appeal later.
Right. And not only that, but I think part of the battle we're fighting is information overload. That's part of the problem with why this is so very confusing for students in the first place. And so with the intent to be as effective as possible, I think keeping it shorter rather than longer and extraordinarily relevant to what we're trying to jog, which is communicate with us and get us your service, to me would make more sense.
Why don't we see what else we have here and see how these other things may fit in, and then we can.
I mean, I also wonder whether or not, in the same way that we provide a notice here, that we also provide a notice when service years have been accepted or rejected, and when there's a final decision there. I mean,
I think we do. Wasn't the annual notice in the prior?
Yeah, so then you would.
so that would.
So I remembered to get my mic that time. So in the annual notice, it does, you're being updated. Like, so say I submitted for a service year and I think I've got it. And then I look back and the department doesn't have that. Then I know I immediately have to ping them and say, now time out here. You rejected this. So, but I completed my service.
Can we scroll back up a little bit, Aaron? Because I think we talked about it, but we did not. All right, so right there, number 2. I just want to look at number 2 in the entirety. At least annually during the service obligation period, the secretary notifies the grant recipient of terms and conditions, requirement for the grant recipient to provide the secretary upon completion, the time frame within which the grant recipient must complete, and the conditions under. So this is, again, just a very general information. So it doesn't speak to the things that we were
But I think
talking about.
it's already happening, correct? That you were stating that they do get told in their
I'll tell you where we
note
got sidetracked. Because even if it's already happening, as far as regulation goes, I would like to have that annual notification, number 2, to include service years or obligation already met, because I don't see that. It's just saying the obligation but not what was met.
I wonder if because I sort of hear where you're going with this, but also the terms and conditions that the grant recipient must meet to satisfy the service obligation. If that's an annual thing, does that change therefore? Would you perceive that 2I, like each year,
It changes.
the terms and conditions that the grant recipient must meet to satisfy the service obligation changes based on whether or not they've submitted
Well,
their paperwork?
actually, I think what we intended there was simply a reminder that basically you got to teach in a high need field of low income
Yeah.
school. for
That's
years.
what I was
Okay,
reading. That's
okay,
what I was
okay.
reading. So maybe right there I would just suggest an A.
Well, I'm wondering, like, Romanet 3, the time frame, our intent there was to say you've got to do it by this point, and are you suggesting we expand that to be a little more,
How many
to
years?
kind of do
Yeah, like you said,
something
2 or
that
4.
comparable
That
what they
village
already did.
conversation that
You know, you've already done X number of years, you
Yeah.
got
Yes.
X number of years to go,
Left.
and you have this much time to do it, that kind of
Yes.
thing.
Okay.
So we need to be
Well,
explicit there. then.
We already have
focus. Everybody's thumbs up. All right. Oh, Aaron is not. Aaron, we need Aaron. Where did he go? I'm sure he'll be back. Yeah, take a see if you can find him. Go ahead. Because we really do need Aaron. Particularly since we're about to, I hope, at least move on to the next piece after wrapping up a little bit more in this one. I don't have his, even if I wanted to get on there, I couldn't because everything is locked. I know, it's like there's nothing I can do, sorry. We can still talk about it. They wouldn't have any way to write though.
And they make your internal passwords anything like they do ours. It's like,
They make you get your own and change it.
I had to change mine just the other night when I was working here, and I was like, I'm never going to remember this. I'm never going to remember this, because at least, I do not write it down, but at least within my office, on my calendar, I will put down something that will remind me what it is, because it's so.
I have a password management.
But you have to be so careful because the scammers can go into your phone and find all that stuff.
Because I have to have my FSA ID password 180 characters long. That resembles a word.
Oh my gosh.
It's actually pretty bad.
Yeah.
It is really bad.
Yeah. I would never ever remember it if I didn't put it somewhere.
Yeah.
And I certainly don't want to write it down because that would be really bad. So
Yeah.
And you found words that weren't even words.
Well, that's the running joke. I'm sitting here with the Fed saying this, but that's is they just my security because now I can make up my own. Now I have to write it
You
down.
still have to change it every other day. Okay. Feels like
Oh no, please just, it's fine. Don't worry. Well, we can't start without you. Most important person. We're running our red line. Okay. So before we move on to number 4, are there any? And when I say 4. I'm talking about Romanet 4, because we haven't talked about, because there's also 4 right below that, so I don't want to forget that one, that we have that one. Are there any other pieces that we want to discuss before we go on to Romanet 4? Can we just go on to Romanet 4 at this point and assume that people will be wordsmithing over the break?
I actually think that we're still talking.
We're still talking about, or we're talking about the new inserted, and that we haven't even gotten to what was previously listed as 3. So did you mean Romanet 4 of
This one,
this one
the
being?
old original. So no, you're right, we haven't gotten to 3 either.
We haven't gotten, yeah, we're not at 3 yet.
The new form.
Right. Because there's 3I, double I.
So now
And
we're
then
on to the
4.
new 4, or the 4 that
Okay.
was previously
How about-
3.
Let's just read that.
We had gone through as far as, I remember reading through, as far as 3 Romanet double I, but that's not this anymore.
Correct. You got it. So now we're going to go to 3, as we have it on the paper, which is now 4
Right.
Yes.
on the screen.
Yes.
on
Which-
our papers, it's page 27.
Yeah.
Which is the notification when a grant is converted.
Yes, that's where we are.
Yes, great.
Yeah.
All right,
Okay.
so
Yeah.
the Teach Grant amounts dispersed to a recipient are converted to a direct unsubsidized loan if the Teach Grant amounts. The secretary notifies the recipient of the conversion and explains I, that the recipient will receive a 6-month grace period before he or she enters repayment in the direct unsubsidized loan. Double I, that the recipient has the option of paying the interest that has accrued since the date of each Teach Grant disbursement, and that any unpaid interest will be capitalized at the end of the 6-month grace period. And then that 3, Romanet
Yeah.
3 should be dropped, but it's
Right.
not in here. that once a teach grant has been converted to a direct unsubsidized loan, it cannot be converted to a grant unless the grant was converted to a loan in error, and that was where the error verbiage was added. And then finally, 4, Romanet 4, the process by which the recipient may contact the secretary to request. Sorry. If the recipient believes that the teach grant was converted to a loan in error, the deadline by which the grant recipient must submit the request for reconsideration, and a list of the specific documentation required by the secretary to reconsider the conversion.
Has the department started defining what that process will be? Because it's referred to and then not described in these regulations.
Yeah, at this point, we haven't really talked about what this going forward process would be, but.
Is there something you were thinking or about?
Well, so I have heard from folks who have tried to appeal their wrongful grant loan conversions with FedLoan, and they're never told that they could appeal the decision with the FSA Ombudsman. I've heard from folks who talk to the FSA or who talk to a Department of Education representative and are never directed to the FSA Ombudsman. I've heard of folks who heard from the FSA Ombudsman that their grants converted to loans could not be reconverted. So I just want to, I would hope that during this process we would have a more clear process defined.
Well, we recognize that we haven't currently had a clear process defined, and probably haven't publicized it as much as we could. So that's the intent here, is that going forward to spell that out, be a little more transparent about it.
So during the next session, should we come with proposed language around the process so that we can discuss? Okay.
So I did also want to flag. I did also want to flag what I mentioned earlier, and wanted to get the sort of opinion of the folks around the table regarding counseling and that sort of idea. I think this is sort of the right space for that, and what additional information should be provided to someone who now has a loan.
Are you thinking like a third? So you have the in addition to the guidance that institutions are given when they're doing entrance and exit counseling, you have the PDFs that are the initial and exit counseling as well, that it would be like a third document?
Like conversion counseling?
Yes, some sort of. You have someone who has had a grant and now has a loan, and so when someone receives a loan, they have entrance and exit counseling as part of their program. Not necessarily suggesting the full gamut of counseling, but that's also.
I think that'd be a good idea, because there could be some teach grant recipients that don't have loans,
and so
and they didn't go through entrance or exit counseling.
So they need to know about options like consolidation, like the different repayment option or ways of repayment plans.
Where would you add that?
Right, and I also one other point that I think I mentioned earlier too was that I do want to make sure that there is information provided about public service loan forgiveness as well.
Oh, go ahead. And teacher loan forgiveness.
I just have a question. So I definitely agree with adding information about the other loan forgiveness programs that exist. One teacher brought up to me that the teacher loan forgiveness program is almost identical qualifications. So if they may have been eligible for Teach Grant, they likely would also be eligible for the teacher loan forgiveness program. And it would just be more if they were teaching in a high need position as opposed to a regular position. But I am wondering, with the counseling, would that put an obligation back on the institution to follow the alumni?
I don't think it would be the institution. I think it would be the servicer.
So it'd be like another web-based program, most likely.
Right. I mean, that's what we have now,
Okay.
are all web-based. We would have depending on how we would incorporate it, I would suggest kind of mirroring what we've got currently for exit and entrance.
This is something we can think about too until the next
Again, what we have now, I am not a fan of, but it's better than nothing.
I think my question is it the servicer that should do it, or is it something that we should look, I don't know, forgive me, FSA should do, or as we think through this, because I think we all agree, especially because there could be students who do not have loans, that this is a necessary thing, but we should also make sure that we are considering the right provider. I don't know what that necessarily means. I defer to my.
Maybe
I defer
this
to
might
my.
help. Currently, not all, but most institutions rely on the web-based tools which are provided by FSA at studentloans.gov. There are still some smaller schools that do the face-to-face counseling, and we do face-to-face counseling whenever we can, but it doesn't touch everybody. We rely on the web-based. So when you say whose responsibility would it be, I would envision something at studentloans.gov,
Okay.
but maybe called conversion counseling. So the tricky part is that, the onus really is on the institution for entrance counseling, and we cannot disperse the loan funds to the student until it at least appears as though they did it, when maybe their parent actually did it. But until it appears as though the student completed entrance counseling, we can't disperse. So the onus then becomes, what reliable mechanism can we ensure that they get the information other than just mailing it to them, telling them they have a requirement? So I think that's going to be the most difficult piece.
I think it's basically the same with regular loan exit counseling. You as the school, you have to tell the students that they're required to complete it, and if they don't complete it, you have to mail them or
You
provide them
notify
with a link.
the second notification,
But
right?
the bottom line is there's nothing we can do. Unlike entrance counseling, there's no hook. If you're a first-time borrower,
Exactly.
you don't get your loan until you do it. But if you don't do the exit counseling,
It's not like you don't get a loan.
yeah, or
Right.
or we're not going to say, well, we're
Otherwise,
we're not-
I wouldn't do the
we're not gonna
the
convert your
conversion
grants
counseling.
unless
I'll just
you
keep my
complete
grant
the
things.
counseling. So-
Right, that's not
right.
gonna happen.
So there wouldn't be that,
Right.
which is good
But
and fine to some degree.
I would say that for some folks, even having initial counseling, exit counseling, conversion counseling on the FSA website, they do refer to those documents. I've heard them talk about referring to those documents, especially, we hope that the OMB form process fixes the form, but when those forms are confusing, folks do go back to the counseling. And so I still think it's worthwhile, even if we don't know if it's going to reach students, because it's not, if it's not touching them at the intended place,
I do want to say, since a few minutes with the feds in here, and I'm sure that this is completely out of the scope of what we're doing, but that exit counseling that we're talking about, you don't have a hook, but you do, because you have an interest rate. And when FELP, probably so, but when FELP lenders were doing their thing, I'm aging myself right now, but that's how they entice their borrowers to do things after exiting the institution, is they would reduce their interest rate by 5% or something. So just something for you guys to think about. Just saying, because you do have that. And if they do their exit counseling, you could.
We actually can't do that.
I know for that.
There's statutory limitation. We can only give a lower interest rate in order to encourage timely repayment. We used to have a little more flexibility, but no longer.
But maybe we can change that in the new higher ed authorization that's coming just any year now.
NASFA has that in our, we have that in our HEA recommendations, so that's one of ours.
Just out of curiosity, is there a place in these regulations where you think that actually could live? That's my other question.
I do, and I think it does belong in the right here, because we're talking about at the time of conversion. So I would, and I could take a look at existing entrance and exit requirements and kind of mirror some of that and bring it next time.
Perfect. Let's make a note of that.
Can you read that and see if you're okay with how I have it characterized?
In the
Can I actually, just as we're thinking about how to define the process going forward for the next session, what, so I know that there's not a process now. Would the department to be able to process disputes, assuming that all of the disputes that have been coming up, like there will always be some servicer errors, right? Like that's just sort of inevitable, and there will always be some issues with form submission, inadvertent administrative errors. Would the department need to specify that at least one full-time employee deals with teach grant disputes in that set of regulations? I just need a little bit more. How does that work within the organization of FSA? Is it ever, would you require within the regulations that there's a person?
But I would look at FSA
Okay.
because that's a different organization. So.
Okay.
I have a comment on the reconsideration paragraph, and specifically the word believes. It says if the recipient believes that the grant was converted in error. Can we change believes to is able to provide evidence? Sorry, it's in 4. Is able to provide evidence.
Wait a second, though. I mean, I would want them to look through the entire process. I think if they believe that their grant was converted in error, it should direct them to where the full process is defined elsewhere, and then that process would be defined as needing to provide evidence.
Can we, in this case of error, can we put servicer error there? Just simply because we're talking about the student perspective.
But then that would limit if.
Your
for
mic,
any
your
reason
mic's not on.
But wouldn't that limit it for any reason it wasn't a servicer error and it was something, because we're asking, remember, the servicer is acting on behalf of the secretary, but if there were some other error that unforeseen, unthought of here at the department, if you just say servicer, then it can only be a servicer error. I would rather
can't
leave
think
it
of it
more general.
Any other error? Other than the student's error, in which case this is sort of an endless loop of paper submission.
Because for a student, it could just be, I forgot my deadline in error.
No, I understand that. I understand that. But I'm thinking that because this is regulatory language, to leave some room, not necessarily with anything specific in mind.
Well, I'm not sure that the verbiage we've been relying on to parse that out has been determined to be, at this point the sentence is clunky. The process by which the recipient may contact the secretary to request reconsideration of conversion if the recipient is able to provide evidence that the teach grant has been determined to be, what? That doesn't work.
What about if we use just an administrative error, or administration error? That way it could be servicer or.
I think a student can also make an administrative error. Whoops, I forgot to sign it. That could be interpreted as an administrative error.
But that shouldn't be the basis to convert their whole grant. If it's a whoops, I forgot to.
I'm not
sign
saying it is. I'm saying the student could perceive that as. I'm not saying that it would be.
But I also think this is.
Ha, I remembered. This is not what the student's going to be reading.
Yeah.
So, I think this again.
Correct. It's not what the student's going to be reading, but it's what's going to govern the process by which all of these are reviewed.
Correct, but I think you keep saying that the student would read it as these things. So I guess trying to process everything you're trying to share.
So you wanted me to put in by the servicer at the end of the comment and just leave it as a placeholder?
Well, I'm trying to grasp why that would be, because there's been concerns have been raised with that particular word.
Yeah.
I mean, in this context, as we think about it, right? So if this is just the information provided to someone who is, about to undertake this process, and they're being notified, then you're just simply providing them the process by which they can appeal. I don't necessarily know we need to spell out specifically what error. I would hope that as a student or a borrower or previous Teach Grant recipient would understand that, and I would want them to think that they could file an appeal in a variety of settings. I don't need them to necessarily parse out exactly if my case fits here exactly right. I think it would be nice if they felt like it was converted in there to go ahead and do that.
You'd get rid of the change then, is what you're saying?
I think in error is sufficient, is really what, I don't know if we need to go through and wordsmith each.
Well, and also I think then if we take out believes and is able to provide evidence, then we need to sort of tie up the end, because the end of this is the evidence that the secretary would be asking for. And so I still think if we do go with changes from believes, but to that end of what you just shared, Stephen, if we're not going to sort of parse things out, then it should be left open to that the student believes there was an error, so they enter into this process. And the results are not necessarily that the department agrees that there was an error, but comes back and says, thank you for submitting all of your documentation, yada, yada, sorry. Or, thank you for submitting your documentation, and then we shift into the, hey, you just got converted back to a Teach Grant.
I agree with that, and that's why, and that's why able to provide evidence, I'm not sure we want that.
I think the believe state might, or something.
And then I think we'll get into a broader conversation of what now constitutes evidence.
So, but here's,
Which
instead
we
of
would
is,
maybe
how about
want to
will
avoid.
be able to, because here's what concerns me about leaving believes in there is it establishes this process as a beliefs-based process, not an evidence-based process. And so I think will be able is indicating that they don't at this point need to, but they will need to submit evidence. That's why that evidence versus beliefs matters in my mind.
Right, but at the end of that statement there, it does say that the grant recipient must submit the request for reconsideration and a list of specific documentation required by the secretary to reconsider the conversion. So as you finish off that section, it already lays out, you have to prove it with this documentation. So that's why I think believes is okay, because they may enter into this and then start reading through all the documentation and go, whoa, I don't have any of this, so I must really, or they enter into it anyway and then really quickly somebody goes, inks, you're out.
I mean, this is also one of those cases where, as we define what the process looks like, we can define what the initial form looks like, and that, I mean, folks will know if they can't complete the form, they will most likely self-select out, or they'll get a very quick response from the department saying, no, this form was not completed, and it does not pass muster, and therefore your loans were not converted in error.
So if they believe it, they must submit the request and a list of specific documentation.
I just go back to things I've said before. Believe to me is not regulatory language that I'm used to or comfortable with. It's one of those, I don't know, I'm much more, but I'm not going to argue the point because it doesn't seem to be winning at the moment, and I get that the second part is there, but it's just not, to me, regulatory language.
Would you rather have it say feels? If the recipient feels there is.
But to me, it actually reads the same, feels or believes, and that's my concern. But
I mean, assumes maybe that this was done in error. I mean, all of this, I hear you in terms of the word believes and the challenge of it being in regulatory language. But I think as we stay student-centric throughout this whole conversation, maybe we just highlight believes and say we want to come back to that word later, or that, that verbiage later to figure out what might be the right thing, because you could believe that you did everything right and still and discover you don't have all the documentation to submit, or go through the entire process and have the secretary still say no, or whoever, not the secretary, but whomever.
What if we just said the process by which the recipient may contact the secretary to request reconsideration of the conversion, period. The deadline, or comma, the deadline by which the grant recipient must submit the request. Well, you can get rid of that and just strike the stuff in the middle.
Great solution. The deadline by which, and then either.
Yeah, you can take all of it out.
Until the deadline, right.
Yes.
Oh,
Agreed.
that's good, all right.
If we just talk about it enough, somebody in the room gets the answer, right?
It takes out error, it takes out evidence.
Aaron? Yeah. That paragraph just right above it, where it says converted to loan in error, is that where you want your,
Add the error verbiage.
add the error verbiage right up there?
It's already there.
It's there.
Yeah.
It's there.
Determined to be converted.
Okay.
To Romanet 4.
Which is now
5. So, if a grant recipient who requests reconsideration demonstrates to the satisfaction of the secretary that a teach grant was converted to a loan in error, the secretary converts the loan to a teach grant and notifies the recipient of the conversion to a grant and explains that the recipient is once again responsible for meeting all requirements of the service obligation under 686.12, which is the agreement to serve.
I think, oh, you go first.
My only addition here is that they notify the recipient of the reconversion and explains the recipient is once again responsible for meeting all the requirements. But somehow I would like to see in the regulation whether the clock's going to give us a suspension for the time that it was
That's exactly
in the
what I
limbo
was gonna bring up.
stage. Because, I know we kind of went through this earlier. Whether during the suspension time, the student or the recipient loses their service time, or maybe even the recipient has the option to choose, I'll take the suspension years, or I will keep the years and use my service time. I just think somewhere right here, if the secretary is going to notify them of the reconversion, that whole thing needs to be addressed.
I agree, and that's what my comment was going to be. I think this is a great place to put in an automatic suspension for, that matches the time frame for which the,
while the secretary determines the status of the request.
and even for while it was converted. I think it should encompass the whole
Yeah,
time
I
frame
agree.
from conversion to determination.
So, yeah, okay.
But the student should have the option to keep the start date back where it was and not use a suspension.
Well, this is where we come
is
back
where we
into
come back-
our discussion.
yeah.
Is it okay to have concurrent suspension and service completion? I would say yes.
I don't read the statute to be an either or.
Right.
I think you can have both simultaneously.
And I would say no.
Can the department clarify?
Why not, it would be if the teacher was doing qualifying service during that period, they get the credit. If they were not doing qualifying service, they get a suspension.
That,
That
yes.
seems fine.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because they get the, whatever
the
works out.
benefit
the
That's
benefit.
exactly what I was trying to say, whatever is
So,
beneficial to the student.
Now we need verbiage for that.
Well, next
Right, so, okay. Would that be triple I then? Yes. This one?
Actually, no. I think it would be whatever indents after. Yeah.
So lowercase a, it's either lowercase or big, sorry, I'm thinking legislation.
Actual process.
We are still in the notification at this point, yeah.
So what do we want to put there then?
And then I guess that's an important thing to highlight for the process provision.
We just need you to repeat what you
Maybe
said.
during
Yeah,
the-
Brian. Yeah, Brian, what did you say? I think he
during
said,
this process.
So,
This is the notification, so
if
we can be pretty
if the
brief.
grant recipient, this is going to be real sketchy, guys. If the grant recipient completed qualifying service during the time of the conversion, they will be counted. If not, it could be suspension, automatic suspension.
So
Be
this,
suspended.
this is going,
Automatic suspension?
this,
There are
The
other,
service would be counted.
there are other periods in which, while we're considering a person's request, I'm thinking total and permanent disability, we don't capitalize interest, or we don't charge interest during the period in which the borrower was in the, what used to be called the conditional discharge period. So this would be somewhat similar. If the teacher was doing qualifying service, we would retroactively give them credit for that service, assuming they had documented that they were doing the service. If they were not doing qualifying service, we would not penalize them for basically raising the issue of, you should have, you know, my decision was wrong, and we would give them a suspension for that appeal period or reconsideration period.
Reconsideration.
Yeah. So while we're looking at it, we're not going to penalize them for that period.
so, this is the notification part. And
Yeah, it
so
may not work
I
there in
think the
particular.
verbiage is a little off.
Yes.
I also want to flag, I know we're still in the notification piece.
But, because it's under double I. Yeah.
So
This is,
if the grant, the secretary.
As we further define the reconsideration process, I would see this as being like part of the result of that process. So we're going to have to add another paragraph to address that.
And then we'd want to add refund loan payments. If the grant's converted back and they made payments on this loan that was never supposed to be a loan, we want them to get the money back.
One question I have for the department, I don't know if this has been considered at this point, but if a loan is converted back to a grant, would that be considered forgiveness? And then how would that affect tax liability?
It's not considered loan forgiveness.
Okay,
It doesn't have
good.
any tax implications.
Great, thank you.
Well, one thing I've just been, and I'm still trying to sort it out, is remember that going forward into what we're proposing, the only things that would convert would be if you ask us to or you run out of time. So I'm thinking there should be far fewer disputes about conversions in error, and I'm even wondering what those errors could be. But if, say, you were converted because you ran out of time and you hadn't provided any documentation of teaching service yet, what I'm trying to envision what sort of error could have resulted in an improper conversion. So this talk about granting a suspension, do you see what I'm saying? I'm trying to, it's not clear to me under what circumstances this would apply. I'm not saying it couldn't.
I think if everything functions perfectly, you may be right, but in an excess of caution, given how the program has
Certainly
functioned
you
so
could
far.
have, you might have a case where maybe the grant recipient, I guess, could say, well, I actually have more time left because the graduation date reported by my school was incorrect. I actually didn't graduate until, a year later. So that's one possibility, but.
Or lost documentation.
Lost documentation, something like that.
Yeah.
And then I'll also say on the suspension provision, and given our notification, there could also be the circumstance where someone becomes very ill, doesn't file for the suspension at the beginning of their illness, gets the notification that their grant is about to convert, and then would submit, or had it convert wrongly, and then is able to submit retroactive suspension paperwork. We did not say that the suspension could not be retroactive. And I think it was presumed that it would be during the pendency of the department determining whether or not the suspension would apply. So there would be circumstances where maybe this could still arise just to administrative issues.
Again, I just want to ask again, if the grant recipient did not complete qualifying service during this time, it would be automatically suspended? Is it going to be automatically suspended, or are you just going to not penalize them? Because that's kind of different, right?
During the time of reconsideration.
Well, because for the period of suspension, that time would be added on the back end of their 8-year.
Yeah, but what I'm hearing Brian say is that they wouldn't be penalized with interest and such, but under the definition of penalizing, you would not count that as part of their 8 years. Okay.
Next. 5, if a grant recipient who requests reconsideration does not demonstrate to the satisfaction of the Secretary that a teach grant was converted to a loan in error, the Secretary notifies the recipient that the loan cannot be converted to a teach grant, explains the reason or reasons why the loan cannot be converted to a teach grant, and explains how the recipient may contact the Federal Student Aid Ombudsman if he or she continues to believe that the teach grant was converted to a loan in error.
So in here, I would also like to add, just in case the student, because remember, they got converted and not the tradition, but we're inserting conversion counseling, but if they felt that they were converted in error, they might not go do that counseling. So I would like to include some language that now sort of reiterates again, because they've been declined and now for sure they've got this loan, that they need that conversion counseling again. I don't know, like a double hit.
So this would be spot 2 where they may receive information on conversion counseling.
Yes. I have no I don't have exactly. Did we have specific language
I don't have
yet?
any verbiage yet, but I'm envisioning whatever comes under number 3.
Yeah, just that this would be 4, maybe, or
I'm not sure.
I think it would be. I think making it a 4 because it's one more thing. It's not necessarily tied to any of these others directly, but make it a Roman numerat 4
Sure, okay.
so that.
And then
And
really
then if we do find that it should shift, but just looking at them
refer back
quickly.
to whatever the verbiage is that we end up agreeing on after I bring it to the table.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it would be the same.
Same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I just want to flag that additional appeal to the ombudsman may be subject to change based on how we talk about the process and whether or not the ombudsman would be the one conducting the appeal of that decision.
Question for the department. I know you haven't considered this process yet, but is it a potential that the ombudsman would be the individual or the office by which this appeal would be run?
I think
The initial appeal?
Yes, the initial.
Probably not.
Okay, so I think we just leave it there because the ombudsman is like
The
the
ombudsman
last.
is the last step if
the
you've been
last
unable
one.
to resolve
Yeah.
it with the.
The
We
ombudsman's
have.
role is not to be a decision maker. They
Right.
kind of coordinate getting
Getting people
information.
together to actually resolve the problem.
That
Yeah.
they're not under the statute. They're not created to make administrative decisions.
Gotcha.
But we need to identify somebody appropriate within the department to do that.
So if we could just add a little bubble that says we need to, that is not the party, just so I have a mental note that it's, the FSA ombudsman is not the appealing agency, but we'll have to identify an appealing, or not the.
I don't know
appealing
that,
department.
I don't
need to
know.
identify it. I mean, that's up to FSA to figure out because they might have someone specific who they train up. And it's not for us to say in regulation that, this individual will be responsible for the appeal process.
But then are we
But this is
assuming-
kind of like the appeal to the appeal.
Yeah, this is the last.
This is the last, this is like the last resort. So the first appeal, we do need to know who's going to be dealing with that. But if you don't like what the secretary says, the only place you have to go
Is the ombudsman.
is the ombudsman.
Or bring an APA lawsuit, but no one wants to go there, so.
Well, I mean,
Do
within the department.
Yeah.
Anything else before we move on? Okay. So,
Go back.
oh,
The,
which is 6. A Teach Grant recipient remains obligated to meet all the requirements of the service obligation under the agreement to serve, even if the recipient does not receive the notices from the secretary as described in paragraph A2 of this section.
So that's just there so a student couldn't say, but I moved, so I never got them. It's, if the secretary never sends them, that's a different scenario, right? Okay.
You have to know where they are.
Wait, but if the secretary never sends them, they also would not have this, that also wouldn't be a defense to a conversion. So that actually is not a different scenario at all.
They just said it was. That's why I asked the question.
It's like we don't even, if we don't send any bills on a student loan, it doesn't matter, the borrower's still required to repay. That's just a matter of, you can't use somebody else's excuse to get out of your obligation. I mean, somebody
so
else's
then-
failure to get out of your obligation.
So then this is saying, I don't think that they would do it, but accidentally they may miss a chunk of students for any of these touch points or notifications. And the student could still have their loan convert. Would it be an argument for erroneous conversion?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm back.
Again, struck the usual.
Does that 6-month grace period change based on the conversations we had earlier?
I just have a question. Why doesn't the Teach Grant count towards the aggregate limit of Stafford loans?
Well, because that would actually be disadvantageous to the student because it could limit your future loan borrowing if you wanted to go back because it would increase your outstanding balance and count towards the aggregate loan limit. So we purposely did not want to count that. So that this is a good thing for the students.
And it would be really difficult to count a grant in a loan aggregate while the student is in school.
Yeah.
So for example, if you had potentially $16,000 in grants converted to loans and they stayed converted and that counted against your aggregate loan limit, well, for one thing, it could cause you to exceed the aggregate loan limit, or it could take you so close to the limit that if you decided to go back to the school, you would have no remaining, no limited or no eligibility for more direct loans.
Right, but the whole reason that the loan limit is there is to prevent people from taking on debt that they cannot, that is excessive, right? I mean, we are putting teachers in a position that if it does convert, that their debt would then potentially be well over the limit and be excessive.
I think one alternative you have to consider then in that case is most likely the student will pursue their additional program and then they may be then forced into non-favorable private lending options, which a number of consumer advocates may find troubling as well.
Yeah.
I guess my question was about the the 6 month, if that changed
Are you
anything.
talking about we had earlier conversations about giving people a grace period?
Right.
Well, this is a totally different grace period. This is really like the grace period you get on a regular direct loan when you graduate and leave. It's the 6 month grace period. This is where we use that term grace period loosely in the other discussion, but that's something totally different from this.
I don't see any language in here, and I don't think this is happening now, but I just don't know if we want it put it in the regulations, regulated. That although the teach grant converted to a loan does not count against the recipient's annual aggregate limits, but they do get the benefits of in-school deferment and such, and they can consolidate these with their regular loans. And so that's been a question, I know, just among my students in my area, not me personally, but in my area, when they know that they're going to not fulfill their commitment, like when they change, they're just wanting to know if once they turn this into a loan, what if I've already consolidated my loans and then 8 years later this converts into a loan? And under the current regulations, if you get a new loan, you can go back and consolidate. But do you see what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it essentially has all the same terms and conditions as what I call a regular direct unsubsidized loan. So if you had previously consolidated all of your outstanding loans and then you had your teach grants converted, you could then consolidate those with the existing consolidation loan into a new consolidation loan.
Okay, and that's what I'm suspecting. That's actually what Fed Loan told us. But shouldn't we put in here where it says is eligible for all the benefits of the direct loan program, we put in here including in-school deferment, but also consolidation, something right there to refer to the consolidation so that it's not just like, it makes it look like it could be separate. Because what the students are saying, my interest is retroactive. I consolidate all my loans from that time period. And so even though it only turned to a unsubsidized loan in 2016, it was really because it was in 2008, and I consolidated all my loans from 2004 to 2010. Is this a 2008 loan that I can't consolidate because it's not new? Or is it brand new because it didn't turn into a loan until 2016? Well, like I said, Fed Loan Servicing clarified that, yes, you can go in and merge it back and consolidate it with the rest of your loans and yada, yada, yada. But that's not spelled out here, so I just don't know, because we've already talked about how some servicers will tell you this and somebody else will tell you that. I think we might have an option here to put it.
Well, then I think if you're going to call out specific benefits, I'm not sure how you decide what to call out. I mean, because they essentially have all the same terms and conditions as any direct unsubsidized loan. And as far as calling out consolidation, I think that if nowadays going forward, more and more borrowers are going to have only direct loans. So if you had regular direct loans, if all you have are direct loans, there is rarely any reason for you to want to consolidate. But so if you had regular direct loans and then you had teach grants converted to a direct unsubsidized loan, I don't know that there's any particular reason we'd want to call out consolidation, because there isn't any real benefit to it. In fact, in some cases it could be to your disadvantage to consolidate your direct loans, because you may lose credit for payments you've made, like towards PSLF or income-driven repayment. But the short answer, though, is that if you did have a prior consolidation loan that repaid all of your outstanding loans, maybe your direct loans, maybe you had some FFEL loans, and then this happens, you could then, if you wanted to, you could reconsolidate this loan with the existing consolidation loan into one new consolidation loan.
And I do understand, like I said, that was what we were advised. I understand what you're saying as far as calling out all the benefits. We're going to air quote benefits, because that could be.
What I was saying was if we say it has all the benefits, including consolidation, I'm just not sure why we would call out
We
consolidation
did that for
in
in-school
particular.
deferment. That's my point.
I think in-school deferment is maybe always a benefit, whereas consolidation maybe isn't.
But you wouldn't have to consolidate to get an in-school deferment.
Well,
If you
then,
go back to school. you
if
get
that's the
different-
case, then it would be even, I'm even more adamant about putting here because it's eligible for all the benefits of the direct loan program. So if in-school deferment is always a benefit, that's already implied. All the benefits. And then if we say including an in-school deferment, then it almost limits, the language almost
that.
limits
Oh,
that.
I'm
Can the
sorry, I didn't
department-
even
Yeah.
notice that we had that
Yeah,
in there.
that
and-
does-
Yeah,
And
can
so
the
my
department
point being just
clarify
having
why
that-
it's in there now?
So either we strike that.
Yeah, I see what
Oh,
you're saying.
you see what I'm talking about? Like, I'm not
Why is
saying.
that there?
Yeah,
Yeah, so we can just strike that and that will be
because I like the is eligible for all benefits of the student loan program,
period.
period. Drop the mic, right? And I can say
Now I get it.
Yes.
everything
Yes,
that
makes
DL
sense to
does,
me.
you know,
I agree,
everything that
yes.
DL
I
does.
think we should strike that.
Can I actually ask a practice question that I am not familiar with? When these loans convert, what does the interest rate freeze from the point where you take out the grant? So it would be the unsubsidized interest rate, or is it the unsubsidized interest rate when the grant converts to a loan?
It is it's spelled out in the agreement to serve. It is the unsubsidized, it is the interest rate for unsubsidized loans that were dispersed at the same time as your teach grant. And so that means that because direct unsubsidized loans have a different interest rate depending on whether you're an undergraduate or a graduate, that carries over here. So if you get a teach grant for a master's degree program, the interest rate is going, for each teach grant disbursement is going to be the interest rate that was in effect for direct loans that were dispersed at the same time.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, that was my only, I just seem to muddy the water every time.
We are through past one. It took us 2 days. We worked really, really hard and we got it done. So we should all just give ourselves a hand because we did a great job. Thank you, everybody. So, next steps. Let's talk about this a little bit so that we have some sense of where we are going to be going forward. We will have worked on, we have a red line here. That's the new updated red line.
So you're gonna email that out to us?
Yes, I think we should email so that everybody has a copy. Now, remember, this is still a proposal. We have not, nobody has really signed off on anything here, right? And, pardon?
It's a rough proposal.
Very rough proposal, yes, because we were going to make multiple passes, yes.
An ad.
And so what I'm feeling will probably happen is that between now and the next time we meet, everybody will be looking at it and thinking through, what should we do with this language? Do we really want these changes? Whatever is appropriate, and trying to get that feedback so that when we meet the next time, we can move much more quickly through the document and start solidifying things that should be solidified, and then making sure everything kind of works together. So I have no idea how long that process would take, but it should work faster than going through this the first time around. I believe that we were asked for some data I don't know when we will receive that data, but if it is possible for us to get it to you by the next time, we absolutely will. Were there any forms that we were supposed to get that we did not give them yet? I can't remember.
The certification form, and Linda, I sent that to you. I found it in the email, so we do have that.
Okay.
And
So,
that's the service certification form, or that's the annual certification form? Can we also get the service?
Well,
certification?
actually, it's all in one. It has all of the ones that are using now has every, it's the certification of intent and
And the certification
the
of
teaching
completed.
service, yes.
How long have you been using that form?
They've been using it for, I don't know, several years now. Fedlin has been using it. I don't think it's changed.
Do you know if Fedlin started using it when they became the servicer, so they started using it in
Not
2014?
immediately. I think it was something they developed afterwards.
Okay.
Shortly.
so we need to get that to everybody as well. Is that something that's easier to email?
Yeah,
Oh,
I
you
sent it,
emailed it
yeah.
already? Okay.
Yeah,
All right, so we can, I guess at
I
this
can
point, we'll email it out.
yeah.
I just want to be sure that we have.
That's
that
what I
we-
wanted to ask.
Yes.
And
I
just-
appreciate all this work, but can we get these forms in electronic format?
Yes, I
As
think
well?
that's, oh, you mean the other forms that were provided today to talk about? Yeah, I think so.
And as well as the, which I didn't get a chance to look at, but the shortage list,
The PDF,
the PDF of that would be great.
yeah.
Well, someone can probably have, like, what are you gonna do with it?
Nothing, you guys can have it.
Does someone want this one?
There's two of them. I just wanted you to understand the, show and tell us.
I will tell you, it's so much easier to navigate. You can export, if you do all the states, you can do all the years, and then you can export all the data into Excel, and then you can sort and filter, and it makes it way easier.
Yes, we could just have a link, that would be great.
Yeah,
Right,
totally.
there
I
is,
can
there is
also
a
email
link,
that out.
there is a link to, yeah.
So maybe a PDF and.
Sophia's, they're planning to phase out that.
Yes,
and
that's
go
what I was
to
going to
this
say. The
regular-
link, there is a link to the, let's sort of step back a second. That's a PDF version compiling what everybody in the nation has done. There is a new link that, I'm not sure how well it's working, so you may, if you don't get on it from Internet Explorer, you might want to try Google Chrome. That is the new collection site, I guess is how I want to put it, for states to submit this information, and then a guest can go in and export this information out. It's still a work in progress, so I don't want to tell you it's.
We had some email exchanges about that. I'd just be aware, I think they're still working out
So
some things because
I'm
like-
happy to send you the link as long as, with the caveat that it's still a work in progress and.
Just as an example, I was actually working on, it was a Teach Grant case where someone was teaching in a high need field listed in the list. It was shown in that document, but I couldn't pull it up in this new one. But it was there in that document, so they're.
That's a big
issue.
I think that's a huge issue.
Yeah.
And I don't know how, and I think you may have had some similar experiences.
I would describe this as this is a better thing to look at for the purposes of thinking about the regulations while we're working on this electronic.
Well, I think we need to somehow communicate that to students. How can we be making regulations that rely on something that doesn't work?
Well,
We have brought these issues to folks' attention. And,
But I think we also brought it up as one of the issues that students have had in the past in deciding if they were going forward or if they were in compliance with the Teach Grant, because of both state, the national list, and the other links, and making sure that whatever we end up saying or stating in the policy that or in the regs, that it's consistent with the most up-to-date information, and that it takes everybody in consideration, right? All of those in
My major
consideration.
concern is that maybe I'm a teacher and I go online to look to see if my service counts and it appears that it does not. What are they supposed to do?
Or
I can't even fathom that.
I mean, what is Fedloan using to determine what is a high-need teaching position versus what is not in rejecting these forms?
Well, how long has this other one been up? It's
Not-
fairly recent.
it's fairly recent.
So I
It's-
have to find out if that is still available. You can still
Yeah.
get to that.
Yes, now you want
Still
it.
get to that. You can still get to that online, and it's.
Yeah, this is gettable online.
But the point, though, is that teach recipients may have been penalized based on this confusing information, and that is very concerning.
I don't mean to, I'm not saying that these are widespread, but as Sophia said, there may be problems with what browser, because I also had some problems doing a search with one browser, but it worked okay with another browser. That could have been part of the issue that I experienced. But we do have this, and that is reliable. I can
It's
find out
also
which
remarkably
ones
stable.
they're using. But I'm not aware of any issues that have come up, and obviously if somebody was denied because they said, well, we don't see that you're teaching in a high-need field, and they could show that it was, then that's the end of it right there. That'll be fixed.
My concern is more that as a person, I'm going to validate that before I send in my paperwork. And if I can't validate it myself by seeing it in a database, I'm not going to send it in. I don't think anybody would.
The link that we provide in the ATS currently is to that. We purposely did not update it yet to this other one, so people who click on the link are going to be taken to that.
But why is the other one even live if it's not accurate?
Well, we don't really necessarily know that it isn't.
No, we just, there's one situation I saw that did concern me, and I brought it to the attention of the people that are working on this. But there are some other more technical issues too that I've experienced with other websites, that they work fine with one browser, they don't work with another browser. That was a problem. Like with the new one, with anything like this, it takes a while to work the bugs out, and they are working on it. And the problems I had were trying to do searches. It was easy with one browser, not with another browser, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think for our next conversation, though, our next meeting, we need to take that in consideration, as well as I think we brought up that there's states that have a list out there, and how we can make sure that we are drawing everybody to the same list or to the national list.
Well, we do. On the agreement to serve and all of our materials, we direct people to this list. That's what we do. And again, what they're directed to is this one, not the new one.
So for our next meeting, we will have some further information on this.
Where does the form, I'm never going to assume anything. The form that's sent out for the annual certification, does it reference that, or does it just say, because
it references the nationwide list. Everything.
So then for
references
annual
the
certification,
nationwide
you're
list.
more than likely going to end up at this electronic database.
You are now, and I'm not. Just to put it in perspective, just keep in mind too that the overwhelming majority of Teach Grant recipients are not. They're teaching in one of what I call the core high-need fields. So it's not. Excuse me. That's not to suggest that that couldn't be an issue, but for the great majority of people, they're teaching math, science. I'm just saying to just put it in, give it a little perspective.
But they also did not know that they could work in these other
But
fields that have
they
been
are,
eligible in their
but
state.
right
I mean,
now,
maybe opting
but
out
right now they are
early.
linked to this. That's where they go.
For the
when they look at
ATS, which they
ATS.
may have filled out 4 years prior to now filling out their service obligation.
Perhaps this is something that as
Well,
you're working on this reconsideration that you're about to launch, that this is also just flagged as one of those potential reasons for conversion. Even if you may not find that that's the case at all, but if it's at least flagged.
And I understand that the department's position today is that they would not automatically reconvert any of the grants that have already been converted. But I would like to bring that suggestion to the main committee in the event that the department may reconsider that position, just because all of these, I mean, these would be so confusing for Teach Grant recipients trying to figure out how to comply with it, which means they should not have, suffer a penalty.
Right, under the
mechanics.
reconsideration process that we're undertaking, if the reason you were converted was you submitted a certification of teaching and you got it in past the deadline, or you got it in and you said you were teaching in high need field X, and the Fed loan for some reason looked at the other database, and it just so happened that the high need field was not in there, but it wasn't here, and by the time you got back to us, it was past the deadline, and you could show that in fact it was a high need field, you would qualify for reconversion.
I hear what you're saying, and I know we're trying to be done here, but I think that when you send out this notice, it's probably already drafted, but this notice that's going to all students who've had their grant converted, I think you need to point out that there are inconsistencies in the database and give them.
But we're not pointing out in the notice that's going out, we're not talking about the reason for the conversion doesn't matter. It's just going to people, if you believe you're meeting the service obligation requirements, we're not.
I don't believe I am, because when I looked, it wasn't in there.
Well, no,
right? That's the scenario I'm trying to highlight.
Why were you teaching in that field? If you didn't believe it was a high need field, you wouldn't have been. Presumably, you would have thought it was a high need field, and that's why you were.
Presumably,
teaching.
And then I would probably be a little confused as to why it wasn't there when I went
to
fill out my.
Well, but if I
remembered that caveat, I know where you're going.
Were told,
we're not used. I mean, this has only been out recently.
Right, it's only
I was going to say, like, how long
yes.
has, I think the other question is, because I know we're starting to look back in time and freak out about all these students, but I think it would be helpful in the email that you're putting out to us with all this information is to say, this website went live on this day, and, you know, how we can be of assistance to you to push at your tech people to fix it.
To clarify that.
Because it sounds like it hasn't been up for very long, and I say that loosely, but I think knowing exactly how long would just be helpful.
I will also, it is interesting to me that the department is suggesting that students would know that now this is suddenly legitimate, whereas they've been told over and over and over again that their grant cannot convert. And so if I was receiving an email from the department saying now I'm up for reconsideration, I would assume it is fraud and wouldn't complete it. So I just think that weighs in favor of automatic discharge to the extent that the department is willing to reconsider that.
Well, I think one of the other things that was brought up by, and I don't remember the name, which, by the way, as a side request, could we get the names and the emails of the people who were in the room from the department? You know how to reach us. It's not fair. It's not fair, but there have been some other people popping in and out, and I don't remember. I think her name was Anna Marie, but she basically pleaded with us to help the department know how to get this information out. And I think that is something that we really need to take to heart, because as you say, when this notice goes out, you might consider it fraud if you're just, and of course, many people will have that mindset. And I think that's something that isn't in this regulation, but, I heard myself going like, okay, why, do you have interviews already set up with papers of record, in each state? And, Twitter, yes. And who's doing Instagram here at the department? Or what can we do in our respective associations and institutions so that this drumbeat continues, so that they do know? Because I hear you that we've got to make sure that I would rather, have the department flooded with people saying, go back and look at this for me, than for them to just have that little trickle.
Anything else? I know she has to go get her luggage. Thank you, everybody. Safe travels, and we will see you next time.